Hello, this is Matthias Goertz with my monthly COVID update. I'm sharing my screen. There it is. So, welcome. Last month, we sent our love to Ukraine. Today, we are sending our love to Russia. Because, as I would argue, Russia will suffer just as much from the current war as does the Ukraine. And it was Russia, after all, that launched it. And as you remember, I've been celebrating the fact that this war has brought at least some governments to taking their eyes off the COVID ball, which, as you know, in my view, is a good thing. So we have to thank Russia for a large number of people around the world increasingly being liberated. Not that I'm supporting this war, I'm not, but it has this unintended consequence that a lot of governments are taking their eyes off the COVID situation and releasing their citizens, at least to some degree, from the oppression and the terror that they imposed on them over the last 2 years. So therefore, we send our love to Russia. Okay. Yeah, the Russian invasion, in a way, ends. The Russian invasion of Ukraine and in a way ends the COVID crisis, not everywhere equally, but in a significant way, or what I actually always been calling the pseudo COVID crisis, because remember there's no COVID crisis except in our minds, or in the minds of many people. And now those minds have been shifted on a new topic, and the news are full of pictures of children in bombed out buildings and bombed out, destroyed army battle tanks, etc., and COVID is sort of history. And since the media are extremely important in sort of suggesting to people what they ought to be thinking, and they're unfortunately very effective in that. Now it seems the whole world is just thinking about the Ukraine war. And COVID is no longer a sexy topic, so it's dropped from the agenda. And of course, governments are driven to a significant degree by their perception of what they think voters want to hear, right? If it seems as though the voters are more interested in the war in Ukraine than for the governments, that means, okay, then we shift our attention to the war in Ukraine. Right? Now, the reason why I'm saying the greatest burden will be borne by the Russian people, perhaps even more so than by the Ukrainian people, who, of course, at this moment are bearing the brunt of this. But when the dust settles, then whatever is left of Ukraine, it has not been annexed or permanently occupied by Russia, will be firmly incorporated into the European economy and will receive massive rebuilding funds, investment, and support. Whereas Russia, on the other hand, will not, or to a much lesser degree, because a lot of Western countries will shun Russia for a while. The sanctions that have been imposed on Russia will not be lifted that easily, right? Even if some kind of a settlement or at least a ceasefire is agreed. Right? And the effect of these sanctions is often, medium term, not short term. So, the Russians will feel the effect for years to come. And I think most important, so it will impoverish Russia further. Russia was already quite impoverished under Putin. He's apparently better at invading countries than at running an effective economy. But it will become even more than it is today, a quasi-dependency of China. Because China needs Russia for raw material, access to raw material, of which Russia has a lot and China needs a lot. And so for China, Russia is a very important vassal, semi-colony. Of course, they're not colonizing it, and they wouldn't attack it because Russia is too powerful militarily. But de facto, more and more of Russia's exports of what they can export, largely raw materials, plus some weapons, will go to China. So there will be quite an increasing dependency on China. Russia will just be the supply backyard for China. And China will emerge from this as the main winner. At the moment, actually, the Western alliance looks like a winner in that it's strengthened, it's standing together, which is good. It's shown it can respond with a single voice against this kind of a challenge. So at the moment, that seems to be strengthening the Western alliance. But the main winner, I think, will be China. They basically, if Russia is really dependency of China, they gain both a nuclear shield to the north, because Russia is not going to allow anybody attacking China from that side. And if you look at the geography of things, the border between China and Russia is the longest border for China, and the most important border. And secondly, Russia will be their quarry, right, for quarrying minerals and such things that they need, right? So that's not a very pretty picture if you happen to be sort of based in the West. Although the West has been doing quite well in its response, it is not going to emerge as the main winner from this when the dust settles. It will be China. So when I say with Russia to love, I'm not actually celebrating that they went to this war, because it will, from the perspective of many people, it is a negative, right? Maybe from the perspective of almost all people, it's a negative. But I'm just pointing out that the one thing it did do is it overshadows COVID, and that's really a good thing. And remember, I said before that we were on this, slippery slope over the last centuries of going from, as human beings, of fighting wars against heroes or princes, to fighting wars against the common cold virus, and now even against global temperature. The meaning of war here becomes, well, it goes away. War becomes ever more meaningless if you go to war against a common cold virus, right? There is nothing humane or human about that. You might say, but is a war ever humane? Yeah, a war is humane in the sense that if it pits humans against humans, it's not humane but human. Let's put it this way. It is a perfectly human activity ever since we've been around, right? It's part of our way of being. Yes, you may be pacifist and say, well, wouldn't it be lovely if we had no wars whatsoever? I'm not sure. I think there are always some reasons why a war can actually be required. But anyways, it's a natural human thing to do. And if we were to overcome war entirely, it would be somewhat unnatural, although that doesn't mean necessarily that it's bad, right? As humans, we are able to some degree, overcome our nature. But war is very much part of our nature. But a war against the virus is not, and a war against temperature is not either. Right? So what I've pointed out is that with the help of Mr. Putin, at least on this slippery slope that we've been on, at least we've sort of taken a step back or two. At least now there's someone where a state, at least a state, which is an agglomeration of human beings, if you like, is fighting war against another state. That puts us back at least onto some kind of like human scale, whereas the war against the SARS-CoV-2 virus was entirely unhuman, ahuman. So at least a war between Russia and Ukraine is human. And I think you see that in the pictures on TV, right? They're showing real humans suffering, fighting, killing, being injured, fleeing the country. Yes, a lot of those things are not necessarily behaviors that we want to see, right? But they're human behaviors. I mean, the last 2 years before that, we've just seen people walk in the streets with a mask in front of their face, which is totally not human to do. Or to lock themselves into their house and not voluntarily, right? I mean, if it was voluntarily, you could say that everybody has a right to do that, right? But it was involuntary. So that's completely inhuman or ahuman, treating basically human beings like animals. In a war, you don't do that. As I said that before. In a war, you treat your counterpart still as a human being. Yes, you want to overcome them, you may kill them, but that's still a human being that you're interacting with. You're treating the other side as a human being. You may think that you're the more, superior being, perhaps, but you are treating the other side as a human being. And that is much preferable, in my view, over, a war against a virus, which basically leads to treating everybody as cattle. As cattle in the sense of, we have to manage our population such that they are locked away from the virus or don't transmit the virus, or we have to force vaccinate them for their own good, right? Because they are too stupid to understand whether they need a vaccine or not. So us, the governments, impose it on them, right? Et cetera, right? So treating humans in the best of cases as children and in the worst cases as cattle, right? In a war, you don't do that. In fact, if you kill a child, in a way, you're treating that child like an adult, like a full human being. Right? It elevates, in some ways, the people involved, right, on both sides. Right? A war is something, and I'm not romanticizing war here, hopefully, and I'm not saying, everybody's a hero, but it elevates us as humans. It can bring the worst out of us, and it can bring the best out of us. A war against a virus doesn't do any of that. It's anodyne. It's a desert of the real, as some people call it. There is nothing in it that elevates us as human beings. So that's why I'm sending my love to Russia. Now, just briefly on what Russia is actually doing, I was just trying to think about it, just for out of interest, right? So, I mean, one thing that may be useful is to compare the flag of the Russian Federation today, which is the flag here on the right, and the flag of the previous political entity there, which was the Soviet Union. The Russian flag is, is based on, if you like, nationalistic and historical value. It's actually, this flag has been first used in 1696, so it's quite an old flag. It was then, I think, used as a marine flag the first time, and it was adopted as a national flag by Russia in 1896, and then readopted in 1993 after the Soviet Union broke apart. So I checked what these colors mean. Usually these tricolors, they have, the colors have some meaning, right? And it differs, of course, from country to country. And in this case, white means nobility and frankness, blue means faithfulness and honesty, and red means courage and love. So in a way, it's quite an emotional flag, and it's it plays on what is perceived or wanted to be Russian characteristics or traits of Russian people and values that Russian people hold dear. Yeah. Now, under this flag, under this sort of nationalistic or historical or even emotional flag, the Russian Federation in 2014 annexed the Crimea. It also quasi-annexed or quasi-occupied two regions in the Donbas region in the far east of the Ukraine. And then, of course, in this year, to 2022, the Russian Federation invades Ukraine. So under this flag, Russia behaves like either a kingdom, like a tsardom, if you like, an empire, or like a nation state of old. And that's why in the headline I said, in the wake of Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson was a US president during World War I. And the one thing that he's really remembered for is that he sort of posited a doctrine of self-rule for nation states. And the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and also of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, these were among the losing powers, and they were broken up because they were multi-ethnic empires. And Woodrow Wilson and others were proponents of nation states. So out of the Austrian Empire, for example, came modern day Austria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, and then parts of Croatia, parts of Serbia, parts of Romania, and lo and behold, parts of Ukraine. The very western part of Ukraine was the city of Lviv that you hear a lot about in German is Lemberg. The city of Lemberg has a long tradition as part of the Austrian Empire, with being a multi-ethnic city with lots of Germans, a lot of Jews. Germans and Jews together probably were almost a majority at some point. Poles, Ukrainians, Hungarians. So it was a melting pot, except not a melting pot in the sense of the US, where everybody speaks English, or well, some speak Spanish, but it was a multi-ethnic melange where people, they basically spoke their language, and 4 or 5 different languages were regularly heard on the streets of Lemberg or Lviv. It just gives you a feeling, right? So Russia, in a way, today acts, or Putin, let's say, acts in the wake of Woodrow Wilson. It was Woodrow Wilson who said, you must bring your ethnic community into one nation state, right? And that's what Russia is trying to do here. Right? It's not maybe the only thing that they're trying to do, but it's clearly part of this, which is that they say, well, the Crimea is in fact predominantly ethnically Russian, and some parts of Eastern Ukraine are either having significant ethnic Russian minorities, or they are Russian speaking. They may not actually be Russian ethnically, and the boundaries are not maybe 100% clear, but they may be Ukrainians, for example. It used to be called, in the olden days, it used to be called not Ukrainians, but Little Russians. So there were the big Russians, there were the white Russians in what's now Belarus. And then in the southwest, there were the Little Russians, and those are nowadays known as Ukrainians. So there was a distinction already hundreds of years ago. But they were always considered to be very close, ethnically very close, right? And in the Ukraine today, have a situation where they are considered ethnic Ukrainians. Most of these people, even in the east of the country, are considered ethnically Ukrainian, but many of them speak Russian. Right? So if you're a nation state, and if you follow Woodrow Wilson, so what do? Is a Russian speaker Russian, or is he a Ukrainian, right? Ethnically, right? Because language usually is part of the definition of an ethnicity. So it's very tricky. I'm just saying all of this because it is actually historically the whole of Eastern Europe, even everything between like Eastern Germany and Austria, all the way to Moscow, not quite, a bit before Moscow, is historically, ethnically very diverse and complicated. Right? So Russia today imposes on its neighbors a policy driven basically of Woodrow Wilson's doctrine, formulated in the early part of the 20th century. Now, if you go back for a moment to the left flag, the Soviet Union flag, that was, if you like, an ideological flag, not a nationalistic flag. not an emotional flag, but perhaps more of a rational flag, actually, right? Because, you know, the communists think of themselves as being rational, right? They base their thought on philosophers like Karl Marx, who are very rational. Whether they act rationally or not is a different question, right? It's just their ideology is supposed to be rational and not nationalistic. It's international, yeah. It's cosmopolitan in some ways. And their colors and their symbols mean the following. The red is the original color of the International Workers' Revolution. And the first workers' revolutions came in the wake of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century in many parts of Europe. Right? So this color red became sort of the color of the workers standing up to their being exploited by capitalists, basically, in the wake or during the Industrial Revolution. It's not an invention of the Russians or the Soviets or, you know, necessarily the Eastern Europeans. This color was used on the streets in Paris or in Berlin or, you know, wherever there were workers rising. Right? The hammer and the sickle symbolize workers and peasants. So that just means, originally, Karl Marx had developed his theories for industrial workers. That was his target group. He didn't really think that peasants fit his concept. Right? However, countries like the Soviet Union, to be, or Russia at the time, the Tsarist kingdom, the Tsardom, the Russian Empire, before it fell apart in 1817, or, for example, China later, when they became communist, those countries were not typical Marxian targets for communism. Marx said communism can only evolve in the most developed capitalist countries. So the UK, for example, would have been a country where he would have thought communism could evolve. He would never have thought that in Russia, which was very backward and not very capitalist, it was feudalist, right? Or let alone China, which had almost no industrial base at all when communism, prevailed in China in 1940 something, 49, I guess, or 47. China had almost no industrial base. So neither Russia nor China were typical countries in which communism, according to Karl Marx, who was by that time dead, but according to his theories, where communism would have been likely to arise. He thought it would arise in Western Europe, in the most industrialized and most developed areas. So why am I saying that is because Russia and China, and the same could be said for Vietnam, for example, the countries which actually experienced a communist revolution or a communist takeover were often not countries in which industrial workers were the majority. Rather, the majority of the population were peasants, because these countries were still largely agricultural. And so it was important, I think, to the Soviet Union when they constituted themselves and they adopted this flag in 1922, and similar in China and in other places, to highlight that communism is adaptable and workable in a largely agrarian society, right? Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to claim its intellectual sort of theories for as part of their ideology, right? So it was important to say it's hammer and sickle, right? It's industrial workers and peasants together who are creating the base for communism in their countries. Right? So that's the symbolism of the hammer and the sickle. So it is not national. It's not saying only Han Chinese or only Russians or whatever ethnic group. It's saying whoever is a worker and whoever is a peasant, you are the basis of this new state. Right? And then the red star is just a symbol of the Communist Party. And since the countries I mentioned just now, they're all basically run by a single communist party, single party state, the party and the state very closely intertwined. And so the same color, yeah, the color of the Workers' Revolution also reflected in the color of the Communist Party, but the star for some reason was at some point adopted by some Communist Party as the symbol, and it's prevailed. You see it in the Chinese flag as well, for example, or in the Vietnamese flag. So the star represents the party, yeah. And so you have in that one flag, you have a color red, which is an idea, if you like, of, you know, workers' revolution or movement. Then you have population groups that are the mainstay of that state, namely workers and peasants. And then you have an institution, which is the Communist Party, which sort of sits on top and manages the things. So in a way, the Soviet Union flag is quite analytically descriptive of what it stands for. Whereas the Russian flag today, the three colors, the tricolor, you have to kind of know what those colors may mean, right? And they may mean different things for different people. So it's more historically grown within a certain context, right? It's a national flag and not an international flag. But what I wanted to just point out is that during the Soviet Union, in 1956, which was, okay, that's interesting, it was the 300th anniversary of a treaty in which Russia apparently first conquered or annexed the Crimea, right? And to celebrate that 300th anniversary and to reinforce the friendship among the different SSRs of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was made up of, I don't know, 24 or so Soviet socialist republics, I think is the word. And one of them was Ukraine, and another one was Russia, and there were many others. And so the Crimea, although it was then ethnically predominantly Russian, was transferred amicably as a gesture, as a gift of friendship from the Russian SSR to the Ukrainian SSR. So one of the things Putin has done in 2014 is just simply taken back what actually historically you could argue was part of Russia anyways, right? Which had been sort of given to the Ukraine as a gift in a time when the Soviet Union did not consider these ethnic questions as or ethnicity as such important, because we were all communists, right? And we are either workers or peasants, and it doesn't matter whether I consider myself a Ukrainian worker or a Russian worker, right? And whether my language is Ukrainian or Russian. Russian was the lingua franca in the Soviet Union, but nobody was forced to speak Russian, right? I mean, the Soviet Union did not, as far as I know, try to abolish languages, except maybe when a population became unruly, maybe the Krim Tatars or something. You know, if a population somehow rebelled against something, then maybe. But generally, they were not trying to equalize everybody in the sense of, oh, everybody has to speak one language. But Russian was, of course, de facto the lingua franca for commerce across the Soviet Union, for many maybe university programs, etc. So for education, yeah. So it was certainly the second language for everybody. If it wasn't the first language, it was the second language for everybody in the Soviet Union. Right? So, but they did not impose ethnicity on people within the Soviet Union, because their ideology wasn't ethnically based or nationally based. It was ideologically based, right? So it's interesting how, in a way, Russia under Putin, or since the Soviet Union came apart in the last 30 years or so, Russia has become more of a normal nationalistic country. Not so different from France or Britain. I mean, talk of Britain, the Brexit. the British Prime Minister, he was comparing the invasion of the Ukraine with the Brexit somehow, and I didn't hear his speech, so I don't know exactly what he said, but apparently he meant it to say, we Brits, when we Brexited, we also defended our freedom, just like the Ukrainians are defending their freedom. against the Russians. I think that's what he probably meant. But of course, the truth is the opposite. Right? Brexit is in fact comparable with the invasion of Ukraine, because Brexit is also a nationalistic project. So in other words, what the Brits do, if they want to compare themselves with what's happening in Ukraine, they would be more close to what Putin is doing than what the Ukrainians are doing, who are defending themselves, or both, right? Both the Ukrainians and the Russians are wearing a nationalistic hat and brandishing a nationalistic flag. Both the attacker and the defender, in that sense, are similar, right? And ironically, what Russia has achieved with their attack is that the Ukrainian nation, which is, as I said before, historically very multi-ethnic and split, was in past elections split between West and East, the East being more pro-Russian, the West being more pro-Western, and so on and so forth. So actually, Ukraine was not a very strongly integrated nation until recently, and it had no history as an independent nation at all. There was zero history of an independent Ukraine until the Soviet Union broke up. And as a nation, the Ukraine was sort of in its becoming, maybe it was a work in progress, right? And one thing that Putin has achieved with this attack is that he has welded the Ukrainians together. And even one thing I think he did not anticipate and underestimated, even the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern part of the country, by and large, are standing by the Ukraine and the Ukrainian nationhood, and not, welcoming the Russian soldiers with open arms because they, you're our brothers and we all speak Russian. The Crimea was a bit different. The Crimea, sorry, the Crimea, the majority of people welcomed the Russian invasion because they really felt like Russians. But in the rest of Eastern Ukraine, that's not, by and large, there may be some exceptions, some pockets, but by and large, apparently not the case. The Ukrainians there, even if they're Russian speaking, and maybe even if they feel ethnically Russian, they're not welcoming the Russian invaders. They're resisting them. Right? So willy-nilly, Putin has welded together a Ukrainian nationalism for the first time, perhaps. So if Mr. Johnson in the UK wants to compare himself with what's going on there, yes, he can compare Brexit with both Russia and Ukraine, because Russian invasion, Ukraine, the Ukrainian defense, and Brexit are all nationalistic projects. I'm not saying they're good or bad. I'm just saying they're nationalistic projects. As such, Brexit is indeed comparable with the Russian invasion. Right? And Boris Johnson's crusade to get Britain out of the EU is quite, on that level, quite comparable with Putin's crusade to bring, Russians back into his home. Right? It's a nationalistic project. The curiosity about the UK is, of course, that it's not one. It's a nation made out of four nations. Right? The English, the Welsh, the Scots, and the Irish, Northern Irish. So the UK is in a very precarious situation in that it acts like a nation state, but it actually isn't. Right? And the most logical thing, if you took Boris Johnson's thinking to the logical conclusion, that logical conclusion would be for the UK to split up into four. Because if you really play the Woodrow Wilson nationalistic, ethnicity-based or history-based approach, you could argue that there shouldn't be one UK, there should be four nation states. I'm not arguing this is the case. I'm just saying if you follow the logic of Boris Johnson. The problem with politicians is they always have a logic that, as long as it suits them, but not further than that, they never take it to the limit, or they do, but only if it suits them. Right? So Boris Johnson celebrates Brexit because it makes Britain strong and independent as a nation, and forgets that Britain isn't a nation. It's a conglomerate of nations. So yeah, very, very fun. You know? But insofar as Putin is concerned, so whatever we think about this, and a lot of people say this is unbelievable in the 21st century that this kind of behavior still happens, right? People had maybe thought we had relegated that to the history books, but not at all. I mean, if you look at Russia's history over the last 20, 30 years, they have actively supported breakaway republics in Georgia, in the Caucasus. They have actively basically forced Belarus to be, you know, a dependency of Russia, almost like a Russian state. They then in 2014 occupied the Crimea. They have been actively supporting Russian-speaking insurgents in Moldavia on the eastern side of the Dnieper river, I think is it? No, which river is it? Anyways, major river running through Moldavia. So the Russians have over many years now been actively fighting little wars or pseudo wars or proxy wars in provinces or regions in what they call the near outside. So the areas that used to be part of the Soviet Union and where there are many Russians or Russian-speaking people. So ethnically, there's a strong connection with Russia, and they have actively been either fostering independence movements or sending soldiers not under the Russian flag, not in the Russian uniform, but trained in Russia, you know, so, as they did in the Donbass, right? So actually this invasion of Ukraine, it did surprise me. I did not think Putin would launch an all-out invasion of Ukraine. I didn't think he would, so I was surprised, but it is not surprising in the bigger scheme of things if you think about the development of what he has done. Why he now really stepped up from little wars into a big war, I don't know exactly. What triggered it, maybe just he's getting old and he wants to leave a legacy, and you know he's feeling his time is running out, or maybe he felt that Biden, the US president, is weak and you know now is a good time. Maybe if what's his name, Trump would still be around, maybe he wouldn't have done this. People like Putin respect strong men, right? They disrespect sleepy Joes. Now Biden, by the way, has responded well, I think. So no criticism here of Biden, but in the eyes of Putin, that may have been a reason. That he's, oh, this guy, this sleepy Joe guy, you know, he's not going to do much, right? He was wrong, right? There may be many reasons why he launched this war now and really stepped up what used to be small interventions in the near abroad, and now it's like a major intervention in the near abroad. Why exactly he did that and why now, I cannot tell, but it may just simply have to do with his getting older and time running out, or his popularity in Russia declining, you know, his position over time eroding. He reached his maximum somewhere now, and then, you know, and someone like him doesn't like to see their position eroded. So they do something, whatever, they do something to strengthen their position, right? I mean, this war in Ukraine is as much about his position in Russia as it is about Russia's position vis-a-vis Ukraine. Right? But anyway, I'm not a Russia expert. I'm not a Putin watcher. I'm not a Kremlin watcher. I'm just guessing here, but there will have been some confluence of reasons why Putin launched this all-out invasion at this moment. COVID may have something to do with it, right? People were around the world were preoccupied. So maybe he thought he would get away with it, right? Or maybe it was something that Zelensky did or said in the Ukraine, who was, of course, nudging the Ukraine closer to the West, towards NATO and the European Union. Of course, that was something that Putin would not accept, and maybe there was something that triggered Putin saying, now the red line has been crossed and I need to act. So I really don't know. I really don't know exactly why Putin did it now, but it is not out of character, and it is not so different from things that he has done previously. It's just a bit bigger scale. I think what's actually truly different this time is the reaction of the West. because all the smaller scale things that Putin did, he got away with, including the annexation of the Crimea. The West, of course, protested, and there were a few sanctions, but basically the West let it happen, right? Partially because maybe the Russians living in Crimea, being the majority, actually support it, right? So in some ways, if you're a Woodrow Wilsonite, you would have to say, yeah, the Crimea probably really does belong to Russia, right? Whatever the historical circumstances, how it was like gifted as a present to the Ukraine. But if you're a Woodrow Wilsonite, then you might actually have to admit that, well, the Crimea maybe does belong to Russia. Insofar as any geography ever belongs to any state. I don't subscribe to that at all. I don't, as you know, don't subscribe to nation states at all. So I'm just putting myself into a certain logic, and that logic Woodrow Wilson had formulated. He may not have been the first one, but he was maybe the prominent one to do that about 100+ years ago. And in that spirit, the occupation of an annexation of Crimea, although it was never legally accepted by anybody outside Russia, right? But it was nobody, not de jure, but de facto people said, okay, we don't intervene. Right? This invasion of the Ukraine proper, the whole of the Ukraine, is a different animal, right? The West could not just simply do nothing, right? But I think the vehemence of the reaction of the West is what's new. Not Russia intervening in the so-called near abroad. That's not new under Putin. That's been the rule. Right? It's happened repeatedly. But the West saying, now you've crossed the red line. This is one step too far. We cannot accept this. That is new. And the West being unified around that is new. And that is probably something that Putin underestimated. Right? That's why he's now in trouble. Here's another, I mean, just for history buffs like myself, I found this beautiful map somewhere. Some gentleman, Spiridon Ion Kepleanu, sounds Romanian, I think, put this together. So green countries are NATO, and EU members, and then the green with the blue star, like Turkey, for example, are either NATO or EU members. And then the blue are some countries that are applicants to the EU. So you can largely see that, I mean, one of Putin's complaints is that since the Soviet Union broke up, and remember, the Soviet Union went all the way up to the very far left of this map here, right? Even beyond, into Eastern Germany, which is not even on the map here, right? West of Poland, right? That's how far the Soviet Union reached inside Europe, right? So after the breakup of the Soviet Union, a lot of countries have joined the Western Bloc, as Putin would call it, right? Either by becoming members of the EU or by becoming members of NATO or both, right? And the only ones who have not, that are of substance, are, you know, Belarus, which Putin has, or Russia has been able to keep very close to them with a dictator who runs it in a Soviet style fashion, right, or in a dictatorial, you know, authoritarian fashion. Ukraine to some degree, right, and maybe Georgia, and you know, I don't know how much Russia has been interfering, for example, in Azerbaijan or Armenia, which have been at war with each other, or whether Russia has stayed out. Syria, they have intervened, right? Which is not that far away from Russia either, right? Yeah, so they, you know, I think it is true, whether he has any right to complain about it or not, but it is true that after the Soviet Union broke up, a big chunk of Central and Eastern Europe joined the Western camp. And that's, for Russia, is a security concern, to some degree understandable. If you are not part of that group, and Russia doesn't apparently want to be part of that group, then you're separate. And if you're separate, then this is a concern. Right? I think that's logically understandable. Even if NATO says we are purely defensive and right? And the EU says, look, we don't even have an army. But, you know, they are powers, right? They are powers, and they are at your western border. And if you're not part of them, then you're potentially their antagonist, right? And therefore it's worrying. So I think that's understand. It's not right or wrong, but it's understandable that the Russians might feel that way, right? And if you look historically, I mean, Russia above all, or the Soviet Union rather, vanquished Nazi Germany, right? I mean, out of the top 5 countries that vanquished Nazi Germany, the top 4 are Soviet Union, Soviet Union, Soviet Union, and Soviet Union. I mean, forget about these Hollywood movies of invasions and Normandy landing and basically it was the Soviet Union with the support of the West that managed to overcome the Nazis, right? At any time during that war, virtually any time during the war, 80% of the German Wehrmacht was stationed on the eastern frontier with Russia. Yeah, and 20% were maybe fighting, those Brits or those Americans or those French or whatever. Right? So 80% were fighting the Soviet Union at any time during the war. That's where, and remember, Hitler didn't care about Western Europe. He wanted Lebensraum im Osten, right? He wanted living space for Germans. That was his ideology, right? Living space for Germans in the East, especially Ukraine. Right? Ukraine was a major focus point for Hitler. I don't know why exactly. I mean, the goals had been on the Crimea 2,000 years ago, but is that a good reason? I don't know. Nor are the goals really Germans, they're Germanic. But anyways, for some reason, Hitler's vision of a larger Germany, it was all to the East. And his only real target was the Soviet Union. He didn't care about France. He didn't care about Britain. And if the British still celebrate how they stood alone against the Nazis under Churchill, that is only the case because Hitler did never want to be at war with Britain. He didn't care about their colonial empire. They said, you can have your colonial empire. I don't want colonies. Right? He wanted something in the East. And his focus was the Soviet Union. And the whole Western Front and being drawn into war with France and then this, the area war over Britain and the U-boat wars in the Atlantic, all of that for Hitler was sideshow. He didn't actually really want to be there. He was forced by the Western allies who declared war on him to go to war with them. He didn't really want. He just said, leave me alone in the East, and I leave you alone. Right? Of course, they didn't do that. But for Hitler, it was in the East, and the enemy was the Soviet Union. Not even enemy. He thought of it as a victim. Right? It was his target to take it apart and incorporate a big chunk of it into the greater German empire. Yeah. Populated with Germans, and the Germans would be the master race, remember? And they would basically treat the Slavic people who lived there as Slavs. Yeah, and Hitler may have pointed out that the word Slav may indeed originally come from the word slave. They have the same Indo-Germanic language root, potentially. I don't know whether that's really true, but these are the games that the Nazis would play to say, look, we are the natural master race, us Germans, and those Slavs, they are the natural slaves, right? That was his ideology, and and the Soviet Union were the only ones who could stop him, and they did, right? And they lost 20 million people in the Second World War, 20 million, more than any other country, right? Almost half of the total. Total is maybe about 50 million. So the Soviet Union alone lost 20 million lives. They fought to the very end against the Nazis. And as a result, or as a price, if you like, it allowed them to push their sphere of influence right into the center of Europe. And the Russians will always have felt it is right that we got that influence because we are the ones who defeated Nazi Germany and liberated basically the rest of the world from them, right? And they are not quite totally wrong, right? Of course, they weren't alone, but they bore the brunt of this, and they feel that they earned and deserve a sphere of influence that reaches deep into Eastern and Central Europe. Again, I'm not saying they are correct. I'm just saying I think that's how they're thinking, and it's not totally illogical. And that is the historical background for them saying, we've given that all up. When the Soviet Union broke apart 30 years ago, all of that went away. and they don't want to have it, right? And they somehow managed to hold on to Belarus. And now they're saying, we want to hold on to Ukraine, or at least part of Ukraine, right? And one of the things I put into this map is the line, the cross-cutting lines that you see. Those are regions which have significant Russian-speaking groups, either majority Russian-speaking or large minority Russian speakers. And you can see Belarus has significant Russian-speaking. So they have their own language, but they also use Russian a lot. You see, for example, up there in Estonia, there is a Russian population, so and also in Lithuania. So in some parts of the Baltic states, there's still significant Russian minorities. That's why they're very worried. That's why they were rushing to join NATO, because they need this protection, because they're worried the Russians will want to bring this home. And they're not wrong there either, right? Because probably Putin would like to if he could, right? And there are Russian-speaking groups in Kazakhstan and maybe in some other parts in the east that are not on the map. But for our purpose here, interesting, there are significant Russian-speaking either majorities or at least significant minorities all across the south and east of the Ukraine. You see that here. Not only in the Crimea and the Donbas, which is number 2 and number 5, but that whole area here that I put the red lines has significant Russian-speaking minorities, right? And in fact, in the city of Donetsk, which is the yellow dot, which is near the Donbas there, or in the Donbas, in the Far East, in that city, Russian is the majority language. And then in the other biggest cities, Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Lviv in the west, those 5 cities, Russian is not the majority. Ukrainian language is the majority. So even up there in Dnipro and Kharkiv, where you might think there are quite a lot of Russian speakers, there are quite a lot of Russian speakers, but the Russian speakers are still in the minority. Yeah. But this is also to some degree a recent development. During the Soviet Union, and certainly during the century before, some of these cities may have had Russian majority groups, speakers. In the last 30 years, as Ukraine became an independent country through the education system, etc., more and more the Ukrainian language has taken over, and the Russian language is losing importance. Right? That's not a reason for Putin to invade the country. Don't get me wrong, it is not a reason to invade a country, but it is happening. And it is something that someone like Putin, who thinks as a nationalist, as well as maybe, if you like, a dictator, if you want, but he's a nationalist dictator, not an ideological dictator. He's a nationalistic dictator. As a nationalistic dictator, he doesn't like to see that, right? He wants to ideally probably stop that process. He may want to carve out a piece of the Ukraine in the east, which says this is either Russia or it is an independent East Ukraine, whatever we call it, where Russian is spoken, right? He may well have something of that type in mind, right? And I put some borders here, the western border of the Russian Empire before the first Polish partition. Famously, Poland was partitioned 3 times between Russia, Prussia, and Austria, right? And then after the third partition in 1795, so just before the Napoleonic War started, you can see here the dotted red line is where the Russian Empire's border was. The Baltic states were part of Russia, Belarus was entirely part of Russia, and almost all of the Ukraine was part of Russia, right? Except that far western part where Lviv is, as I said, that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then what's today Moldavia was then probably part of Romania. Or it was even still part of the Ottoman Empire at that time. But basically, almost all of the Ukraine at that point was actually part of the Russian Empire. So it's not that in any way gives you reason to right to invade. It doesn't. Right? But it is all part of the the mindset that Putin, and not just Putin probably, but some circle of people around Putin who think similarly have. Right? So what are his war goals? He probably wants recognition of annexation of the Crimea. He will probably want some kind of annexation of the Donbas region, and maybe not just that small area that is here marked with the number 5 and in dark red. The Donbas historically it's a bigger region, right? It's a big chunk of eastern Ukraine, right? And he may want to annex some significant portion of that, as either annex or make it an independent but Russian, pro-Russian, Russian-leaning, or Russian, allied state, similar maybe to Belarus, right? He may definitely want to have a Mariupol corridor, meaning the land connection between that eastern region in Ukraine and the Crimea, right? The Crimea right now is not physically linked to the rest of Russia by a land bridge. It is very close to Russia. You can see that here, where the Sea of Azov is, in the north of the Black Sea there. There is almost a connection, but it isn't. There's no land bridge, right? And he may really, I mean, one reason why the fighting in Mariupol has been so harsh, I think, is he definitely wants to annex that corridor. Regime change, until I think a week ago, that looked like a war goal for him. But now that the Russians have said we are not pursuing our attack on the capital, Kiev, we are withdrawing from there, and we are bundling our troops in the east. If that's actually what they end up doing, I mean, they said they are, but I think they haven't actually shown that yet. But it's logical, right? They haven't been successful. Their advances have largely become stuck. The risk for them is that it becomes an entrenched war that can go on for years and years and years. Remember Afghanistan, remember those small provinces there in Georgia, or wherever where the Russians have had those little proxy wars. They go on, or Syria, right? They go on for years and years and years, and they become costly. And especially because when the sanctions really bite, it will take 10 or 20% out of Russian GDP per year, right? I mean, they really hurt, right? And not just a few billionaires, but they really hurt everybody, right? So I don't think Putin wants this to be an extended affair, a protracted, immobile war, right? I think he wants a resolution. And I think he has decided that maybe regime change isn't part of the resolution, right? I mean, the Ukrainian president Zelensky is very popular now. He's outed himself as a true war hero, maybe unexpectedly, but even including for Putin, who probably didn't anticipate that at all. But it's not going to be easy to do a regime change now, unless you really occupy Kiev and significant other big cities and impose, right? But it seems their offensive has not achieved anything like that, and it seems as if for Putin that's maybe not the most important thing. So rather than have Russian equipment and people and soldiers killed, and this becomes such a protected affair, and maybe people in Russia are starting to ask questions, he has redirected, or I think he will redirect his forces to the east and really go for those objectives that he always had in the east. Certainly that Mariupol corridor, that land bridge. Will he split the Ukraine? Possibly, yeah. I mean, in a way he already has, because by annexing the Crimea, he already did create a split, but I think there will be more of a bigger split of, some kind of eastern Ukraine will be split off in some way, at least that's what he wants, and become another Belarus, meaning a country that is notionally independent, but highly dependent on Russia, or it could even become part of Russia. Right? Now, none of this is acceptable to Western powers. So I'm not saying Putin will get what he wants, but I think that's now probably what he aims for. Right? He needs to get something out of this. Otherwise, his position in Moscow, in the Kremlin, becomes untenable. He has to show some success, right? Whatever, and he will say, look, you won't get us out of these occupied regions in the Ukraine unless we have a deal, right? So, and he wants, non-expansion of Ukraine into NATO and the EU. I think Zelensky has already said, okay, we can forgo NATO membership if we get some kind of security guarantees. I don't know. First of all, NATO doesn't give security guarantees outside NATO, I don't think, right? Secondly, there was a security guarantee when the Ukraine, this is another little interesting anecdote, right? After the Soviet Union broke up, there were actually nuclear weapons, not only in Russia, but also in the Ukraine. And the Ukraine, on the prodding of Russia, as well as others, gave up their nuclear arsenal that was on their territory and said, okay, we will be a denuclearized country, but in exchange, we want to have a security guarantee by Russia, by the US, and I think Britain. And I think those three countries, Russia, US, and Britain, signed a pact that guaranteed the Ukraine security and independence and territorial borders. So Russia, if I understand it correctly, has now obviously already in 2014 obviously breached its own pact that it entered. But the point being, a security guarantee may not be good enough, right? But maybe that's what maybe Ukraine is now shooting for, right? EU expansion is different. I think Ukraine will want to become a EU member, or at least a very closely associated member, or an EFTA member, or something like that, very closely tied economically. And I don't think Russia can prevent that from happening. But that's, of course, whatever is left of Ukraine in the West, right? That doesn't, if there's a separate Eastern Ukrainian state, that will not be part of the EU for a long period to come, at least not if the Russians have it their way, right? So there will be some deal making around these things, but I think the biggest risk is that if Putin doesn't get at least some part of his war goals accepted by the West, he will just leave his troops wherever they are now, and maybe he's still occupying some other territories in the East, and they will just stay there. Just as he had done unofficially in the Donbas region. Right? And this will just carry on for years and years and years, which would be really terrible for everybody. Right? But of course, Putin is not immortal. One day Putin will die and his successor, we will see. Right? But as long as Putin is alive, he will not just let go. He will want to have something of substance out of this this experiment, this gamble, if you like, that he entered. Okay. Again, with Russia, to Russia with love. Russia is a great country with a great ancient culture, a great people, and not every Russian supports this. Now there are many Russians who do support this, yes, but there were also many Brits who supported Brexit, and if their prime minister likes to compare those two things, I didn't come up with this idea, and I wouldn't have, but since he loves the idea to compare himself with the Russians, yeah, the Russians are to some degree just as nationalistic as those English. It's natural. What I'm saying here is that there are nationalistic people in all these countries, unfortunately. And all these countries, including all these green ones here on the left, they're all fostering this nationalism, right? Not only the Russians. And so to some degree, I have sympathy with them, not because I like this kind of nationalism, I don't, but their nationalism in the end isn't any worse than that of many other countries in Europe and other parts of the world. Right? So I wouldn't single Russia out for being particularly nationalistic, not at all. I think they feel like they have been poorly treated by history, and maybe they have, right? And they don't like it, right? That's, yeah. Not that anybody is to blame for that, right? I mean, their fate is like any country, is to some degree geography, where they're located, and the history, and you're all caught up by that, right? But they, I think they have a general grudge against the rest of the world because they feel they didn't come out of the whole history of the last 200 years in the manner they would have deserved, given the the investment in lives and so on and suffering that they made. The Russians invested more in life and suffering than almost any other country. Right? And there may be a feeling right now that, oh, we didn't get the best return on that. But to blame the Ukrainians for that is, of course, absolute rubbish, right? I don't think they are blaming the Ukrainians. Or to blame the West for it is not really right either. Right? But it is true that the Russians have not had it easy either, right? So I have a lot of sympathy for Russians in general, as I do for Ukrainians. I don't have a lot of sympathy for any kind of nationalism, and I have zero sympathy for invasions of any type. Yeah, but I do note, and this is my summary, right, that because of this whole melange here, which is so, it looks so like 18th century, right? It looks so like it doesn't fit into the 21st century at all. It's almost like anachronistic and a fallback to an ancient time that everybody thought we had passed. But the one thing it does do is it links us back to our humanity. And gets us a little bit out of this COVID disaster that for me is such a huge challenge. I find the COVID situation much tougher and harder and more difficult and ugly than the invasion of the Ukraine. The invasion of the Ukraine, at least I can explain it. And I'm trying, I'm spending so much time here on this call now because I'm trying to explain it, right? At least to myself, right? Well, what is Putin thinking? What are the Russians thinking? What are the Ukrainians thinking? What is the West thinking, right? What are the Chinese thinking? At least I'm trying to understand it. And in doing so, at least they're all like human players. Right? The problem I had with COVID is I just can't understand it. Yeah. There's, for me, no way of understanding why almost all governments in the world just completely drop their constitutions like overnight just because of a common cold virus. I mean, I just can't get it, right? The most precious thing they have is their constitution, which gives people basic rights as a human being, like the right to choose when you step out of your door. It's as basic, or whether you breathe through a mask or you breathe freely, right? I can't breathe through this mask, I'm sorry. Maybe some people can. So, my most basic biological mechanism is breathing, right? It's being impeded by other people against my will. Right? I mean, this is much worse than anything that's, whatever the Russians are doing in the Ukraine. Right? It's much more humane in comparison, right? I know 4 million Ukrainians have left their countries and 10 millions are displaced. And 2,000 or so civilians have probably been killed, which is not a big number if you think about it, right? So I don't think the Russians are excessive on the whole. Maybe Mariupol now, they are starting to get really excessive. And I don't support it. Again, I don't support that. But I mean, think about it. I mean, 2,000 civilians is not such, given the amount of weaponry, modern weaponry that is being unleashed here, it does not look as if the Russians are deliberately targeting non-combatants, right? You will always hit some, of course, if you go to war, but I don't think they're deliberately doing that, at least not yet. So what the Russians are doing is in a very profound way, much more humane than anything our COVID politicians have done. Right? And that's, for example, as a German, I can say the entire German parliament, with probably zero exception of the members, there are 600 or 700 members of parliament, they all contributed to that, what I consider the greatest crime against humanity ever, which is the COVID policies. By comparison, what Putin is doing is chicken feed, right? I'm sorry. And again, last time I apologized to the Ukrainians because I know they're suffering, and I am with them, right? But it is chicken feed by comparison. COVID policies affected 8 billion people, and they're still affecting us. I mean, where I'm sitting, I am still very my whole life is destroyed by these policies. My whole life in the sense of everything that I value, which is my ability as an adult person to make my own choices for very basic things, is being destroyed by COVID policies. I mean, I almost wanted to show you a picture of Ukrainian refugees. One thing you notice when you see all these refugees who go on trains to the west or something, or to corridors to the east, no masks. Not a single person there is wearing a mask. And these, I mean, the pictures I saw. I didn't bring a picture here. No masks. Yeah, they may be fleeing from military, artillery fire and rockets and all that, but nobody's telling them you must wear a mask while you're fleeing. I'd almost rather be in the Ukraine now than in Singapore. I'm honest. Yeah. In the Ukraine, maybe I would volunteer, take a weapon and fight for my country. In a place where you're oppressed by COVID rules, it's nothing you can do, nothing. In Singapore, if you do anything, they put you into a mental home because they say you're crazy. I think I'd really rather be in the Ukraine now than in Singapore. I not want to single out Singapore, I just happen to sit there at the moment, but many countries are still massively suppressing their people because of a common cold virus. And what I'm saying is I cannot understand it. And I probably for the rest of my life will not be able to understand it. Whereas what Putin is doing, I don't like it. I don't agree with him. I don't think he has any right to do any of this, but at least I can understand what he's doing. I mean, rationally, logically kind of trace what he's doing. I just simply cannot logically explain what governments around the world have been doing around COVID. I just simply can't. And that's why I'm having these talks, right? This is, in my view, is completely unprecedented. I mean, even the craziest Nazi ideologies of Aryan race and, we have to exterminate the Jews or whatever, right? All of those, which are, they are really impossible to understand, right? Because they are so inhuman. But even those are still in some way treating the target group, whether it's the Aryan race, which is the sort of the positive, or the ones who don't belong, who's like negative, but they're still somehow thinking of them as human beings. Right? The COVID policies go outside of that. We are not treated as humans, we are treated as potential carriers of a virus. As a transmitter, a potential transmitter. Not as a human being. So this goes even beyond the worst ideologies you could possibly think of that humans came up with before, such as the Nazi ideologies. Right? Which were, I mean, very, very difficult for me when I thought about them. When I was a young man, I was interested in history. I just couldn't understand them, right? But I tell you, COVID is worse, or let's put it this way, it's even less understandable. Because there's absolutely nothing human about it. It's a pure technocratic regime, as if we were robots. Oh, you're a robot, you need to be oiled that you work well. And we have to clean you so that you do your job. Yeah. The idea that maybe I want to decide myself whether I expose myself to this virus or not and how I behave, right? No. It's collectivism, right? It's collectivism because the focus is on transmission and not on what really matters, which is my immune system, right? But what the focus of all these policies have been on transmission. And therefore it's a collective. And if you don't want to be part of the collective, you get hammered. So, with love, to Russia with love, and that I think leads us on. Let's go talk about COVID now. Just one note that, I just looked at these figures that, Worldometers publishes every day, right? This is the daily death in conjunction with COVID, reported death in conjunction with COVID, right? and you draw the 7-day line through it. So that's the brown line, right? As I always do, just because it smoothens the, the weekly cycles of reporting. On Sundays they don't report, on Monday they don't report, then on Tuesday they report a lot because they didn't report the 2 days before, etc. Right? So you have those shagginess of the line, the reported numbers is basically a weekly reporting rhythm. So you put the 7-day line on top of it, it smoothens this out, right? So that's what the brown line is, right? And I mean, it just appeared to me, and I hadn't thought about it, is that, if you were to draw a correlation curve through the brown curve, from the very beginning, let's say 21st of March, which I usually treat as the first day on which significant numbers outside China were reported of death, right? So 21st is sort of my start day. I know from country to country it varies. Some countries started a bit earlier, some countries a bit later. But, yeah. So from 21st of March, I looked at it, I think actually literally on, not quite on 21st March, so on 13th March. So yeah, this is not a mathematical formula, right? I just hand drew a red curve as a correlation curve through that data. And guess what? It is almost a perfect horizontal straight line, right? In other words, on average today, the number of deaths per day are basically the same as they have been in the early stage and in the mid stage, right? With some seasonal variations, and then you had when a new variant came, so you might have a spike, right? But basically, the number of fatalities has been remarkably stable at about 7,000, 8,000 per day on average. Right? Yes, right now it's going down. Actually, the last few days, it's really going down now. So, I have to admit that that looks very promising. But the point of this curve is that the perceived fear factor, I call it, and this is a purely imaginary line, right? The green line, for a long time, it was very high and, in a way, much higher than the actual figures warranted, because as you know, I've talked about how these figures weren't that outlandish compared to, pneumonia fatalities in the past, in the not so distant past. We had these pneumonia fatalities at similar rates per capita, as a matter of course, right? And nobody raised an eyebrow about it, right? But when this came, the fear factor was extremely high. And my argument would be the number one driver of that was the politicians, right? I mean, in the moment where they declare lockdown, which is quite an unprecedented move and completely illegal, right? Well, the only way you can do it is by basically suspending your constitution, creating a state of exception, right? As I said, which they did, right? All of these countries did. But, so it's quite unprecedented, right? And I mean, the first thing that suggests to people is that the thing is much worse than it seems, right? And that the governments know something that they are not sharing, right? So the fear factor is massively driven up by those political choices, right? I mean, if the governments instead would have said, calm down, let us explain to you what we are expecting to see, what the data shows us, right? Here's how we are thinking about this virus, like I've been trying to do, then the fear factor didn't need to exist at all. I mean, there will always be some people who are more fearful than others, of course, right? And that's their right, right? People have a right to be fearful. But it would just have been on a much lower level, right? The other element is the media, of course. The media, I don't mean to always blame the media, but they have just been so terrible in the matter of COVID. I mean, they are terrible enough in all questions, but on COVID, they have been just completely off, right? I think I once said that you can give me 99 publications by the media, whether on TV or in the newspaper, and sorry, give me 100, and 99 out of the 100, I will show you why they're wrong. I still mean it. Right? Virtually everything they say is either wrong or misleading or misguided or counterproductive. Right? Yeah. And even when they report facts, and the reason is because the facts they report are irrelevant. Right? And those facts that would be relevant, they don't report. So, anyways, I've talked about this enough. So, politicians and media drove up the fear factor, maybe Hollywood with, all these disaster movies, and maybe a general angst among people about viruses or whatever it is, right? Huge. This is not to scale, right? The fear factor exceeded the actual danger by, many orders of magnitude in my perception. I can't prove that, right? There's no mathematical formula for that. But, it was way out there, right? And it stayed high for a very long time until, and it differs by country a bit. The US came out of this quick, and the UK then, and so on. But, on the whole, and Sweden, as I said, tried to never go into this fear factor, but they didn't quite manage, even though the government really tried not to get into this panic. But the people still wanted to be panicky, at least some people in Sweden wanted, some politicians, some opposition politicians maybe, or even in his own party, right? Some people, we have to be careful, whatever happened in Sweden, I don't know. So no country really managed to avoid this massively overblown fear factor until Omicron came along. So interestingly, even the advent of the vaccination in early 2021 did not significantly affect the fear factor, apparently. I mean, this is my perception. Even though it was very clear the vaccines are effective, and if we were to give them to the right people, those who actually need them, we would have a wonderful outcome, but it did not significantly reduce the fear factor. It was Omicron, and I can't fully explain it either, that switched the psychology, where all of a sudden people said, Omicron is less harmful than before. Yeah, it is less harmful, but only maybe by 30% or 40%. Remember, I talked about that last time. So yeah, significantly less harmful, but not that much. I mean, it can still kill a lot of people, and it does. But somehow in the minds of people, maybe they were just tired of it, and they had enough of it, and they wanted to change, and it's almost like a switch, like it's hitting the switch. And we've gone from a lot of people being very fearful to the vast majority of people being much more relaxed now in a very short time of a few months. And I think the trigger was Omicron. And then, as I argued earlier, the invasion in the Ukraine in the last months or so has also helped. Because all of a sudden, people want to have a certain amount of fear, apparently, but they can shift it to a new topic. And they have other worries now. Prices are going up. Gasoline is being, not gasoline, but heating gas is being rationed. I mean, they're talking about that now in Germany, for example. Right? So, I mean, people all of a sudden, this is like, it affects them personally, right? And all of a sudden, COVID is no longer such a big deal, at least in most parts of the world. There's still some parts where it is a big deal, but on average, the perceived fear factor has gone from way too high to, you could almost argue, a little bit low, right? Because, hey, this is, we still haven't vaccinated all those people who really are at risk, right? And who might really benefit from repeated boosters. Right? There's still work to be done, but somehow in the minds of people, it's gone from, this is a catastrophe, and this is like the biggest catastrophe ever in our lifetime, to, yeah, this is just another medical problem. Let the medical profession deal with it, and the healthcare system, which is a very healthy attitude, actually, because the healthcare system can absolutely deal with this. But the question I'm asking, why didn't we have that at the beginning? That's exactly, the attitude now is the right one in a way, but we could have had that from the beginning. So, what I don't understand is this sudden flipping from exaggerated fear to almost exaggerated disinterest. That I don't understand. It's not rational. But it's interesting. I mean, that's how humans behave on the aggregate, right? This is an aggregate picture around the world. I know it's not accurate. I know it's like very conceptual, my drawing, but that's what I'm perceiving. Right? And it's not easy to explain. It's not at all easy to explain this, because the numbers of fatalities are the same. I mean, now at the moment, they are really going down. They're now lower than they were ever since like March or April last year, 2 years ago. So yeah, I admit they are really now going down. In many places, they're very low, and as expected, because penetrations now are very high, we'll talk about it. Vaccination rates are quite high, and a lot of people now have quite an amount of both natural immunity plus some booster and whatnot. So, and it's the end of the winter season in the Northern Hemisphere, right? So that comes on top, right? So yes, you would expect the numbers to go down now, yes, but I don't understand why all of a sudden people are able to understand that, where the entire 2 years before they were not able to understand that. That part I don't understand. I mean, there's nothing happening now that we couldn't have predicted, right? There's nothing happening now that we didn't basically, at its core, already understand 2 years ago. There's nothing we've learned over those 2 years that would explain this massive shift in the perception of the fear factor. So I just can't. It's another one of those things. I just can't explain it. Yes, I think people are just tired. Maybe it's not fear factor. It's a novelty factor that is sort of wearing off, right? At the beginning, oh, COVID, you all have to wear masks. 2 meter distance. Don't get too close to me. You're dangerous. And now they're like, oh, okay, enough. I want to travel again. Yeah. Of course, I'm human too. I also want to travel. But it's just, it's irrational. It's human. It's human, but very irrational. And that is a bit surprising, because I would have thought, at least in many Western countries, people are so on paper so educated. I mean, they spent 12 years in school, and then plus many of them 3 or 4 years in university, and some even more. And and they get educated. They have so much access to information. I just would have thought that people behave more rationally on the basis of genuine information and thinking, right? And what is so shocking to me is that by and large they didn't. And they're only now going back to normal because they've gotten tired, bored. There's no longer any novelty value in this. So now we have the Ukraine. That's cool. We have something new to worry about, right? So they just go there. But that is disappointing. You really wonder what all this amount of education achieves. Very little. I mean, most people apparently are not able to get at the right information that is actually meaningful. They are not able to interpret that information in a meaningful way. They're not able to draw their own conclusions, and they're not able to act on their own conclusions in an independent and autonomous fashion. And I'm talking about, 80–90% of Western populations. I'm not even talking about populations anywhere else. And, yes, there are exceptions, but as a rule, the vast majority of people fall into that category. They don't even know what information is relevant. They don't know how to interpret that information. They don't know how to draw conclusions from that interpretation. They don't know how to act on it. I mean, that is really worrying. And that's after hundreds and hundreds of years of enlightenment and Renaissance and modernism and, mandatory education. And, it's not done very much, right, for most people. Don't get me wrong, most people can live a decent life and make a living, and they do well, they accumulate some wealth. Yes, I mean, all of those things are true, right? And you might say, yeah, but that's great, and that's important, Matthias, and you're just dropping that by the wayside. Yeah. People are educated to pursue a career, to have a job, to do some kind of a trade. Yeah, they're very competent. Yeah. The education system in that sense is working very well. People are trained very competently in some profession or some craft or some trade or other. Yes. But are they being trained to think independently, rationally, logically, systematically, critically? No. By and large, they are not. And I personally found that shocking. I didn't realize how broad-based this observation would be, right? I mean, if you had asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, yeah, of course, probably a majority of people never really think systematically in their life. I mean, they're not philosophers like me or something like that, that do it either as a hobby or as a profession, right? But I mean, when a virus comes along and you don't even, no government in the world asks the simple question, hey, what kind of virus is it actually, right? Can we categorize it? No, I mean, the most basic questions that, any school kid would ask if you start a new phenomenon in class and the teacher says, do you have any questions? They say, what is this thing? Not a single government in the world was interested to know what this thing actually is. And why they would even be worried about it, right? And what nature of worry and what nature of effective actions. They weren't interested. So, and not just the governments, right? The population at large was not interested, and I did not expect that. The other thing I did not expect is that they would so simply give up constitutions that, millions of people died in wars to get to the point where they have these constitutions. In Germany, I talked before, right? Article 1 of the German basic law is, your dignity is untouchable. Every single COVID measure in Germany touched the dignity of people. Every single one of them. So every single one of them is against the basic law. But they just do. And there was very little resistance. There was some people who argued against it, and some people went on the street, a few thousand, a few 10,000, very small numbers of people who pointed out that this is not right. That was shocking. That was shocking to me. When Merkel declared the borders closed, I expected 1 million people in the streets the next day. Actually, there were 0. And I just couldn't believe it. The whole idea of closing borders, I mean, we are human beings. We are not just Germans or English or French or whatever, right? The whole earth is our playground. Everyone has a right to go anywhere they want, in principle, I believe. I know it's not de facto the case, but and a government that I, by the way, never elected, and okay, it's a democratic process, so-called democratic. We've seen now that it doesn't work, but they can order me not to cross the border or to not even cross my doorstep. And I have no right at all to do otherwise. They can treat me like a criminal if I reject, even though in my view, what they are doing is the biggest crime of all possible crimes. Yeah, that was shocking. Still shocking. I still haven't gotten over it, as you can tell. And so now I'm just saying, well, what's interesting is first they go like crazy, like overboard, and now a lot of people have moved on, like that. It's weird how human beings are. Now, it's good that we are able to move on. Right? I mean, it's part of our psychological makeup. I believe that if you have like a major crisis in our life, someone dies who's close to us, or major illness and difficult recovery, we are able to move on, even after war. Even the Ukrainians, when the war eventually, hopefully, is over, they will be able to move on. I mean, that's a great psychological skill, which all of us more or less have, thank God, right? So, yes, I acknowledge that, but this is, in a way, it's positive, right? But yes, people now are starting to just move on. Yeah. But I do ask the question, why did it take 2 years? It's been 2 years. I would have thought that the mood that is now setting in of saying, okay, we have to live with COVID, it's there, okay, it's just another virus, and we move on. I would have thought that mood would have kicked in 2 years ago, within a matter of weeks when the thing started. It took humanity 2 years to get to something that to me was like evident, self-evident almost. Yeah, that. Yeah, it's interesting, right? As a philosopher, you might say that, well, interesting. Right? Not a psychologist, and that's not my field, but it is interesting, yeah, but it's also disturbing. Yeah. And the reason it's disturbing is because it affects people who are not part of this thinking. Right? I mean, if people want to wear a mask, I said many times, right, or they want to lock themselves up, please do, yeah. But please don't tell me to do that, right? So again, they have a right to protect themselves if they feel that they're protecting themselves, and that if they feel that it helps them, and yes, but I have a right to protect myself the way I see fit. And I've said many times, one of the reasons this is the crime against humanity is because people like I have been prevented from exposing ourselves to the virus, in its multiple variants, and thereby strengthening our immune system. And I'm 57 soon, and I'm getting older, and if I don't get the opportunity now to expose myself to this thing, I will be worse off when I'm old, right? It's very obvious, right? I cannot statistically demonstrate that yet to you. I mean, in 20 years' time, looking back, we would, right? But conceptually, it's very clear, right? I'm being prevented from training my immune system on this thing that everybody knows and everybody knew 2 years ago is there to stay, right? That, to me, that's a crime. I'm being prevented from executing the most basic physical needs of a human being, which is to strengthen my immune system. It's just like being locked up somewhere where you're not allowed to do any physical exercise, for example, right? In a prison cell where I mean, it's hard to imagine how you could have a cell where you could not have some type of physical exercise, right? I mean, you have to have some kind of floor, a square floor where you can, at least stand and do just sit-ups or something. It's very hard to imagine, but imagine you were put in a situation where you have like zero right and ability to do any physical activity. I mean, imagine that. Right? And what has been done to our immune system is the equivalent of that. Our immune system has been artificially prevented from exposing itself to, in a natural way, as its natural mechanism would require, to a new virus that has become endemic to us. Right? And that has been going on for 2 years, and in some places like Singapore, it's still going on. Right? But if I die of COVID in 20 years' time, I will not be able to A, prove that I died because of that. B, I will never be able to get any kind of recourse from the government here for this crime. I would never, there would be no way for me to prove and then get recourse for them preventing me from exercising my immune system. Right? But the fundamental thing is not that I'm at the quarrel with some whatever government. The fundamental thing is any adult, you're not an adult if you cannot even control your own healthcare. I mean, we're all being treated, as I said, either like children or like cattle, not like adults. An adult person must be able to have control over their own health. Otherwise, it's not an adult. In fact, you could argue it's not a human being. So this is very fundamental in terms of what do we believe a human being to be? What's our definition of a human being? That's why I'm so disturbed, right? Because this goes at the very basics of what I and what other people apparently consider to be human. What does it mean to be human? That's really the question that ultimately, when you think about it, is at stake here. Right? And I guess my frustration and anger came from my definition of human apparently being very rare. Not that I mind being, an outsider or outlier, but it is a bit disturbing because then all the rest of the population around you imposes themselves on you and treat you like a, I don't know, like a disease or something, like something that has to be hammered down. Yeah. And all I want to be is a human being.
And it's like, I'm not allowed to be a human being because the majority of people around me don't let me. It's like the whole world gangs up against you. It's, nope, we don't allow you to be a human being because we don't want to be a human being, or maybe rather, more correctly, we don't share the same definition of what it means to be human. That is quite existential. That was quite, the last 2 years have been a very existential experience for me. Yeah, not a pleasant one. Yeah. Interesting, you could say, yes. Not pleasant, but here we are. Okay, let's move on. Oh yeah, I just wanted to share one of my favorite words, Gelassenheit. You can translate it in English as equanimity, serenity, releasement, and maybe other ways to translate it. It's a very beautiful word. It's a favorite word of one of the more important philosophers of the last century, Heidegger, who gave it his very own specific meaning, so I don't want to dwell on that. But it's a beautiful word. And I think one of the things for myself, and I cannot change the world, but at least I can try to change myself. I'm now at this point where, I say, okay, maybe I have to really practice Gelassenheit and not about the virus. I mean, I guess what I was going to say is that the humanity should have been gelassen, relaxed, if you want to use a more everyday kind of word, relaxed about the virus from the beginning, and we would all have been much better off. Yes, that also, but I think now I'm at a point where I say, okay, for myself, I need to practice Gelassenheit vis-a-vis my fellow humans, no matter how they behave. Right? So if they still force a mask on me, and if they still, force other things, vaccinations, boosters on me, and whatnot, and they still put hurdles into my way if I want to move around or travel, the best I can do is practice Gelassenheit. Yeah, accept those things I cannot change, right? I cannot change all of humanity. Yeah, I can only try to change myself. So I'm trying to acquire or regain a bit of that Gelassenheit that I usually think I have, actually. But in the last 2 years, I didn't draw on it enough. So that's a good opportunity to take a breath. So let's have a quick deep breathing just to get grounded again, and then we move on to the statistics. Okay, welcome back. So my internal weather report is that actually I am quite calm. I am quite relaxed. I feel quite grounded, quite expanded. So it feels like I'm regaining a little bit of that Gelassenheit that I've been maybe missing for the last 2 years. So let's move on. Talk about COVID as always. So one major new thing, recall I had said that a few months into the year, I would revisit the mortality, the excess mortality or excess fatality figures again, because they are being updated by governments around this time. Usually they do their accounts at the beginning of the new year, look at the numbers for last year. So many governments by now have published excess fatality figures for the last full last year, 2021. Some even are doing it on an ongoing basis and have figures even for January, February, perhaps, but this year, but most don't, but at least for up to December, end of December 2021, quite a lot of figures available. But what really happened is, so I was looking, remember, usually I had to pull it together from different sources. My main source was theeconomist.com, who have been publishing this on a regular basis, but there were also other sources, and The Economist seemed to be very high figures. So I always calibrated my figures that I got from The Economist against other sources where I had them, and usually found some kind of like an average between them, or some plausible figure. So my figures were always a bit lower than those that The Economist had published. So what happened is that a new study was published in the Lancet, which is a medical journal, for mortality figures between January 1, 2021 and December 31st, 2021. So really, the COVID period, right? And a really rigorous, thorough, extensive study looking at data from around the world, and finding relatively high excess mortality figures. Right? The total figure is 18.2 million. Now they say 18.2 million people probably died from COVID. No, this is total excess mortality. Some of these people will not be because of COVID, but because of, for example, misguided policies and other secondary effects. Some other people who should have gotten medical treatment couldn't get it in time and died because the capacity was held up for COVID, for example. These things happen, right? And they say that here, by the way. I highlighted that on the top right. Some deaths may have occurred indirectly and not directly linked to COVID. Exactly, right? And in fact, I've been always arguing quite a significant number of deaths have occurred, not directly linked to the virus, or the immune system reaction to the virus, but to other secondary effects. But be that as it may, their study does not separate direct COVID fatalities or SARS-CoV-2 directly linked, meaning really immune system fatalities, or largely pneumonia fatalities, right? They don't separate them from all other indirect kind of fatalities that may be indirectly linked to either COVID or to the human response to COVID, meaning our policies, etc. Right? They don't do that. They only have that aggregate number. But as you know, in my model, I also use that aggregate number, and I'll show you in a moment. So that was interesting. So I looked at their study. So instead of doing what I used to do previously, which is, go to many different sources, gather some data here, some data there, try to calibrate it, and try to get some kind of meaningful averages and plug them into my model, I just decided to accept their figures, or rather, not quite. Because they also refer to the Economist study, and they also say, yeah, the Economist is the other study that is similarly robust as ours and has tried to do a similar thing. The figures are somewhat different, not that hugely different. The total in the Economist was like 18 million, and they have 18.2, so very close. On a per country basis, though, they are sometimes quite different. So in the aggregate, they are similar, but per country, there can be quite big differences because they do use either different sources or to some degree also different methods of calibrating the data. So, and I don't mean to judge whether this study is maybe better than The Economist or equally good or what, right? This study was published in a reputable scientific magazine, The Lancet. I looked not at the details, but I looked at the summary. I went through, the methodology. I find this very credible. Maybe more credible than The Economist, because not that The Economist is not doing a good job, but it's harder to figure out where they get their data from and how they use that data. So if I had to choose one, I would probably lean in favor of this new study. But I think The Economist has one big advantage. They've been tracking this on virtually a daily basis for many months now. So they're doing a little bit what I'm doing, a regular tracing, whereas this study here is a one-off. Yeah? They looked at data from the last 24 months, but it's a one-off study. The Economist is an ongoing updating process. So I don't want to lose the Economist as a data source because in a few months' time, I may want to revisit the data again, right? And then these guys will not have done a new study, right? But the economists may have updated the data where they're able to do so, right? So the economist is still, in terms of the process they're following, is useful because it's a continuous update. The study here, I think, is a very good one-off, robust study, as far as I can tell. So what I've done, in a nutshell, is I've taken this study, and where they differ widely from the economist, I've taken an average of the two. But I've no longer done what I did previously and gone to third and fourth and fifth and sixth sources, even on the country level, knowing though that these numbers, like the ones of the economist, are a little bit high. And having done some of my own searches for data on the national level in the past, I do know you could still find some numbers out there that would suggest that this is a bit high. But I just believe, because on the whole, they've done such a robust piece of work here, really systematically. So at least there's an integrity to this data that they've gathered, that if I just do some snapshot, like pick here, pick there, and oh, this data is 3 months old and this data is 6 months old, I will never be able to do it as systematically as these people do. I mean, there's a whole team of researchers spending, weeks, if not months, doing this, right? So I just said, okay, this is it. I take it. I have some reservations. Maybe the numbers seem a bit high to me based on what my own thinking process was, but they've done a much more thorough job than I could ever do, right? And the economist, as I said, similar overall, different in some countries. And because the country level is of interest to me in some places, I've taken the average where the gap was quite large. I just took the two numbers and averaged them. It's just a heuristic. It's just a choice I make, right? So that in some countries, the numbers I adopted will be somewhat lower than the ones in the study. And I think as a total, I took the average of the two, which is 18.1. Right? So they say 18.2. And the economists at that time, which is as per 31st December, said 18. So between the two, it's 18.1. That's the number I picked. Now, recognizing the number keeps growing, right? Because we are now already in April, right? So there are another 3 months elapsed since that data, right? But because I think they are a little bit high, I've not yet gone into the economist data again and already start to grow that number again, right? So if you like, maybe I'm lagging a little bit by 3 months at the moment, but deliberately so, because my gut feel is that they seem a bit high, but that's just a gut feel, okay. But by and large, I've adopted this new study as my new driver of the total fatalities, excess fatalities. And that matters also for my calculation of the COVID fatalities. Now, as I said, these guys don't separate it, neither does the economist. So my model does something that nobody else apparently is doing, which is it's actually trying to say which ones are COVID fatalities and driven off an IFR, infection fatality ratio that is driven by, really triggered by the virus and by an immune reaction to the virus. And what of these excess fatalities are other things? Suicides, and people die because they don't get medical treatment, and people die because of whatever reasons, because of lockdowns, and from the beginning, or from early on, not from the very beginning, but quite a while ago, I started to separate those two figures, remember? And I'm driving my COVID fatalities not off top down of the excess mortality, but bottom up, if you like, of a study done almost about a year and a half ago now, of about 34 or so, a meta study of 34 studies that looked at IFR. And remember, their average IFR across the world that they came up with was 0.25 or 0.24, either 0.25 or 0.24. And remember that ever since, I've driven my IFR off that study. Yes, that study now is 18 months old, and it's very sad that I still haven't found a new one. I mean, there should be a new and better one, but that's the best I have. Okay. Remember, I was down to 0.19 with my IFR because I'd been trending. I started this at 0.25 or 0.24, and then gradually trended it down with some arguments that I don't need to repeat now. So now looking at it again and realizing the gap between excess mortality and COVID fatalities cannot be that huge. If I bump up my excess fatalities based on this study, or based on an average between this study and the Economist data, then I also have to bump up my COVID fatalities. But I do it on the basis of recalibrating my IFR. So I've shifted, I've looked at it, I've gut feel played around, I've shifted my IFR to up to 0.23. So last month it was 0.19. In the previous months, for quite a while, it had been 0.2. I've now bumped it up to 0.23, which of course increases the number of COVID fatalities everywhere and reduces the penetration. But because the overall number increases, the penetration is actually higher than it was before. Right? So the penetration of COVID fatalities, or the penetration with COVID, sorry, bumps up as well. Right? So the excess mortality bumps up, the COVID fatalities bump up by not quite the same amount proportionally, but almost, and the infection penetration also bumps up, not by that much. It goes from like 81 to 86% or so, but still significant. That's just to give you a feel for what I've done. And here's more about this. Here's a summary of the study, and I've highlighted some things, but I really don't want to, and I've shown you the comparisons of my data compared to the data they have. It's not that different. I mean, one thing that came out of this study again, for me, is that how close I am to what these very robust pieces of research, when they happen, what they come up with. And again, my model goes far beyond what they do. And for example, that I'm also estimating COVID fatalities bottom up based on an IFR, which they talk about it, but they don't do it, right? Because they don't have the numbers they think, or they don't dare, or whereas I've been doing that for 20 months now, right? So I feel good about my model. Okay, it is very much in the ballpark, but of course partially because I've kept updating it when interesting new studies came in, right? So it's not so surprising that it is in the ballpark. It should be in the ballpark, but again, here is a new study. It's very robust. It's looked at something very important in the overall picture. And, I accept the study. And what I find is I'm somewhat below in my numbers, but I accept their numbers. But I also see I'm not that far off. Right? So it feels good. Right? It reinforces my approach. They are using an approach that is very similar to mine, which regarding the excess mortality. I've been doing that for 20 months. Right? And the Economist, to be fair, also has been doing that for 20 months. Right? So I'm not even arguing that I invented that idea, right? Sure, there were some other people who also had that idea, right? Including the Economist. But it's validated in a way that my approach and my numbers are validated by this study. Right? You'll see the numbers are a bit higher, but they are in the ballpark. Okay, scenarios, no change, so let's not linger on that. Okay, revised figures. Here, the blue box just says, I've now got this new study, what I just explained. And you do see a bit of a bump up, right, in the penetration from 81% last month to 86%. Right? And it's also consistent with Omicron spreading so fast. And, we are really now in the final stage of where most of humanity has been exposed to the virus at least once. Remember, my model I try to model first infections, not total infections. Some people are now on their third infection with COVID. No, this is a percentage of global population minus China, ex-China, that has been exposed to the virus once. Yeah. But we are getting here to theoretically, eventually 100% of us will be exposed to the virus. Of course, we know there will be a few thousand people who never in their life get exposed, of course, or a few 10,000 maybe. Yeah. But so it's not literally 100%, but it's very close to 100%. Right? that's where we are heading, right? But we are now really getting to that final stage where, yeah, we are not far away from that. And the relevance of that is, my argument has always been that the main reason we see quite a lot of fatalities or severe cases of pneumonia is twofold, right? One, demographics. We just today in our world, we have a lot of elderly people, plus some other risk groups such as people who are obese and people who have diabetes. All of those phenomena are relatively recent. Last 50 years or so, right? In some countries, it's only actually happening now that populations are aging. In Africa, in some countries, the average population age is like 18 or 19 years. Right? So they haven't even started with this aging yet. Doesn't mean they have no elderly, but it means they have very few elderly as a percentage of the total population, right? Which explains why some African countries have very few fatalities. Right? It's not just misreporting. I'm sure there's misreporting or absence of reporting there, not even deliberately, but they're just not reporting. I'm sure that is true, but it's also true that they probably really don't have a lot of fatalities, right? Because they don't have a lot of people at risk. Anyways, so the number one reason we do have globally quite a lot of fatalities is because of our demographics. And these demographics are man-made. We made it so that we live ever longer, and that many of us have a lifestyle that is not particularly healthy, right? I've always been saying that's fine and everybody can do that, but it's an individual responsibility. It's not a collective responsibility that we are so sensitive to a new virus that is per se in itself harmless, right? It's not something where we as a collective, we collectively take responsibility for our elderly or for our people who had unhealthy life. No, first of all, these people need to take responsibility themselves. If they don't treat their immune systems well, they can do that. That's their right. But they cannot then make my life miserable because they didn't take care of their immune system, right? There's nothing wrong with those choices that they make, but please don't turn it against me. That's the point, right? It's not a collective responsibility. It's first of all an individual responsibility. But that's the first reason we have so many fatalities, the demographics. They are what they are, right? We have a lot of elderly, and elderly are very susceptible because it's a new virus, right? That's the second point. The second point why we have fatalities is because it's new. Not because the virus is virulent or dangerous, or the virus is harmless. It's harmless as long as our immune system is working. It's this conjunction of a relatively significant proportion of the global population, and in absolute numbers, we're talking about many millions, not having a fully functioning immune system, and the virus being new, and therefore being a challenge for any immune system, even though the virus itself is harmless, but it's just new. And the immune system shouldn't allow it to slip into the lung, but in some cases, because immune systems sometimes are a bit slow, and that's because they're compromised. So because of this reason, this virus all of a sudden gets into the lung where it can do damage, right? So a virus that is per se harmless becomes, what's the word, deharmified by our immune system, our poor immune response. Right? That's the dynamics in a nutshell, right? So it's the combination of immune systems not being at their best and the virus being new that create this fatality. So therefore, I've always been saying, once we've had a first exposure and our immune system has started to recognize this virus and learn about it and create a blueprint of what the relevant elements of the virus, in our second and third and fourth and fifth encounter, our fatality will be much lower. It will not be zero, but it will be much lower. Because the first encounter is the most critical one. Right? And that is why I've been tracing this number, which is the first encounter. So what I'm saying now, if the numbers are correct, 86% of the global population outside China has now been exposed to the virus at least once. Meaning they have built some amount of natural immunity. So when they get re-exposed, which all of us will, we all will be exposed to the virus multiple times in our lives, unless we are 85 and dying next week, then we will not, right? But yeah, so unless cut short by the end of our lifespan, we will have several exposures to this virus in our lifetime, and there will be different variants of the virus, right? In a way, as we are exposed to all the other common cold viruses, more than 200 of them, and we are exposed to them in a regular fashion, not regular, but frequent fashion. I don't know how frequent, for each of those 200 plus viruses, but each of them we probably meet at some point or another several times over our lives. Not all of them at once, right? But some subset of them, every year we get several colds, and every time we have an exposure to a subset of this total set of more than 200 common cold viruses. And so we have a constant engagement with them, with the phenomenon, and our immune systems constantly adapt, right? And there's a new variant and another variant, and it constant. But because the variant isn't so completely different, it's not a new virus, it's a variant, immune system has some information about it and it can handle it, right? In other words, the more we've been exposed to this virus and any virus of that kind, meaning common cold viruses, the more we're exposed, the more likely our immune system has a good response. Especially when we get older, when naturally the immune system, like the rest of our body, becomes weaker. If we've had enough exposures, the immune system will probably be fine. If, however, we didn't have enough exposures, then the immune system may really at some point get into trouble. And that's my point that I made earlier about the crime of the government's conduct is to keep us away from the virus. And at my age, almost 57, I'm not that far away from becoming a really at-risk person, right? Just based on age and being male. And if in the next few years I don't get some decent exposure to the thing, at some point when I'm 70, I may die of the thing, right? Because I just didn't build a resistance to it. And the reason I didn't build a resistance to it is because the governments didn't allow me to do it. Now, I think that I'm over-dramatizing here because now travel is starting again and mask wearing is being reduced. And so, hopefully I will have enough time to get exposed to the thing and to the variants, right? And everything will be fine. But statistically and conceptually, very clear, this is the risk. My risk has increased because of the government policy. And of course, I'm not alone. Everybody's getting older every day, right? So for everybody, the risk goes up over time. And so the longer you wait with your exposure, basically the worse you could be off, right? So this whole idea of, we have to keep the virus away is actually exactly wrong. It's precisely wrong. Now, except if you are already clearly at risk, then you really do want to keep it at bay because you don't want to take that first encounter risk, not knowing whether it will kill you, right? So I know there's that complexity, and I know it's not easy to define who is at risk and who is not, and it's in the end a subjective decision. All I've been saying is it's a subjective decision on the part of the individual. It's not a decision on the part of any kind of government. How can they? They could never decide on my behalf whether I think I'm at risk or not. They can't, right? The only person who can make that decision is myself. That's what I've been saying all along, right? So they made a decision on my part that is in every respect negative. There's nothing positive about the decision governments have made, right? Not even the vaccination, because if I had a choice, I would not have taken the vaccination. I don't think I need it, right? So there's nothing that, and I'm obviously supportive of the vaccinations for those people who really want them, of course, as I've said many times, but I'm not supportive of governments forcing me to take a vaccination, which de facto they have done. Anyway, so here we are. We are getting to that point where most of us have been exposed at least once. That doesn't give you 100% protection, no, but it significantly raises your protection. Or in other words, it significantly reduces any kind of risk the next time you encounter the thing, even if next time is a different variant. And it's really now organically to just behave normally, like a normal human being. Don't treat this virus any different than any other cold virus. It will be part of our common cold mix, and we will get exposed to different variants, maybe not every single variant that comes along, but over our lifetime, we will be exposed to a fair amount of variants. And that gives our immune system a very rich picture on which to act. Whenever it encounters this virus, it will be quick to, keep it low, right? So we will have a cold, but it will not be allowed to get into the bronchi or into the lung, right? Because the immune system knows the thing, it doesn't know the new variant 100%, but it knows it 99% or 95%, and it is, is able to deal with it, right? Because it's encountered previous variants, right? Of course, the younger we are now, the better, right? Our children, they will probably never have a problem with this virus, right? Any cold virus can trigger pneumonia and lead to death, right? And it does happen, but statistically it's not very common, right? And this cold virus, eventually for young people who are now growing up, it will just be like any other cold virus. So the likelihood that they get a pneumonia and die of this virus, even in old age, will be very low. So in the long run, the problem just sort of solves itself, just as it has in nature with all the other 200 common cold viruses, right? It's just the initial transition period that is difficult, right? And we've made it more difficult than we needed. But as I said, the psychology curve, the risk factor curve coming down, I think we have reached that tipping point, as they call it, where all of a sudden people, maybe they want to go back to normal. And normal just means our immune system will just take care of it, right? We just behave normally. Normal means normal, right? Normal means, for example, no vaccinations required, right? Now, vaccinations, you could argue, yeah, but for elderly, a booster shot maybe once a year, a little bit like what we do with influenza, same principle, right? There will be new variants or new strands. And even if you've encountered previous viruses of the same category, as you get older, your immune system weakens and you may not be able to deal with it well. So for elderly, an influenza vaccination booster, like once a year or so, is quite recommended. Yeah, and I think that's rational, yeah. And we can do the same for SARS-CoV-2 if people want, right? No problem. As long as it's purely on a voluntary basis, right? As long as there's no hype attached to it. With influenza, actually influenza, I've been arguing, is more dangerous. It will, in the longer run, it will kill more people than this virus. Right? It's just in the short term that this virus here kills more people than influenza. But we are probably, next year, we'll be at the point where influenza kills more people than this virus. Just because influenza, for example, is also tough on little children. Little children often have difficulties with influenza. They may die, whereas, especially in developing countries, if the medical care is not right, With this virus, that's almost never the case, right? This virus is similarly dangerous maybe for elderly, but it is much less dangerous for little ones than influenza. So on the whole, eventually, this will be less harmful than influenza, right? But again, if every day a few thousand people die of a pneumonia in conjunction with the virus, and if a booster, if you are 75 or 80, once a year booster can really protect you, sure. By all means, let's do that, right? But let that person decide that, please, as with influenza, right? No government in the world, as far as I know, forces you to do an influenza vaccination. Yeah. So why force us on this one? I just don't get it. But by all means, inform the public that this is available, the booster, make it cheap, make it free if you want, and tell people it's there, and tell people exactly who should consider taking it and why and what it does. I mean, by all means, I'm all in favor of all of that. Right? Yeah, but don't force it on people. Most of us don't need this. And some of us don't like to be forced. Yeah. This is like a rape. You get a hard thing stuck into your body against your will. That's called rape. Right? I've been raped 3 times in the last 2 years by governments. This is systematized rape. And yes, I know we have mandatory vaccinations for children when they're very small, these sort of so-called children diseases. I'm not against that. The child does not remember that it was vaccinated. So that's very different. If there's an effective vaccination, especially something that protects you for life, which is the case for several of these, or at least for a long period, like tetanus is like 10 years or so, to say we want every newborn or infant in the country to receive this vaccination, I think that's appropriate. And the key difference is, one, it's clearly effective, whereas these vaccinations here for most of us are not. They're not ineffective, they're just irrelevant for most of us because our immune system has no problem. But whereas with these childhood diseases, everybody will get it and everybody is at risk. So the risk is very different. That's one. But more importantly, the child doesn't know. It will later, of course, find out. And it's got a little booklet that says, oh, when you were a child, you were vaccinated against these things. But it will just take it as it is. It's fine. Yeah. The child does not remember that it was vaccinated. But I will remember for the rest of my life that 3 vaccinations were forced on me that I did not want. And I will never forget that. Okay, I will practice Gelassenheit. But there is a difference between forcing an adult person to do something against their will, against their body, and having it do something to a small child that doesn't know what's going on, and it's proven to actually be effective. Right? That's very different. Okay, don't want to linger on this. Fatality. So here's the jump, right? Here you see really the jump. So what really jumped up is the excess mortalities, right? So I had like 14 millions, and those 2 studies, the Economist and that study in the Lancet, they say 18, right? Yeah, that's a significant jump, but I accept it. And again, if you drew like a correlation line through my numbers here, it's not that off, right? I mean, I had a bit of a flattening recently because in this December or January, I looked at some of these excess mortality figures in my old version, right? And I just picked up some countries where I had some data from different sources. Remember, I even showed you 5, 6, 7 sources. I think 2 months ago, I showed you on a slide the sources I used, and those figures were just lower. And the economists were always the highest. And so I always took some of the other figures as well and averaged them out because I thought, oh, the economist seems to be aggressive. Now with this Lancet study that is very close in many cases to the economist, now I have more confidence that these higher numbers are probably right. So that's the big shift, right? There's nothing really new here in terms of methodology, but I have a new study that does a good job, I feel. I really read it in terms of at least a summary. I looked at what they were doing and yeah. And what are their sources? Yeah, okay, I accept it. It seems high, but it's not higher than the economist. So we have 2 now that are quite, trustworthy sources. And those other sources that I've been using, it's not that they're not trustworthy, but often the data wasn't updated, and all kinds of difficulties with the data. So I've concluded and decided that I'm better off leaning on this Lancet study plus maybe going forward updates from The Economist. Because, as I said, they do regular updates. Until maybe a new study comes out in a year's time, then yeah, of course I will look at that again. But so basically to entrust myself to these numbers, even though they're a bit higher than mine. And I feel good about that. Right? I mean, I've always said I don't want by any stretch of the imagination underestimate the problem. Right? I'm not here to deny any fatalities or something. No, not at all. Right? But I also don't want to go overboard. Right? I don't want to make up some kind of gruesome figures here I'm not one of the people who want to create panic. I really want to know what it is. Right? What is the case? And of course, we can never know fully what is the case, never. But we can just try to approximate as much as we can. Right? Do our best, and that's what I'm doing here. So I think I'm doing my best by essentially now accepting those higher numbers. And as I said, because I don't think the gap between COVID direct fatalities and indirect fatalities can get too big. And I've always been around 70% or so, you know, of the excess mortality total, about 70% or so were always the COVID fatalities, right? And that gap, so 30% other, I was comfortable with. So I didn't want to bump up here the excess mortality, the blue, without at the same time also bumping up the green, which is the COVID fatalities. And remember, I calculate the COVID fatalities. They don't do that, those studies. So the study only gives me the blue line, right? And only one number for one as of today, right? But that's, yeah. The green line they don't do, right? But I do, and I've explained the mechanism based on IFR. But to create a bump up effect where the gap between the blue and the green line still remain at about like a 70% or so, so the green being roughly 70% of the blue, I had to bump up the IFR. That's the only way, in my mechanism, is the only way to do it, right? So I have to accept that the global IFR outside China is higher than I had thought. In my last model, in last month, when I had a total of 10 million COVID fatalities, that was on the basis of IFR 0.19. So now I've bumped it up to 0.23. I didn't want to bump it up more because remember that study 18 months ago had 0.24 or 0.25. And I don't really want to exceed that number because there's a logic, in my view, for that number, if anything, trending down a little. Right? But I may have overestimated how much it trends down. Maybe it hasn't trended down very much. And the reason for that is that those early studies, they were quality studies, but they were early studies. And remember, one thing that is often then missed in these numbers is that there's a time lag between the elderly being exposed and the overall population being exposed. Elderly people, by and large, get exposed more slowly. Why? Because they're less active in life. Right? So those early studies, the meta study was published in July 2020. So the studies covered sort of March, April, May, June. So the early stage, the first few months of the COVID phenomenon. And I accepted them because they were well done. And, you know, the meta study argued well, and a few outliers they kept out and so on. You know, remember, we talked about it. So I felt confident about that study, but it has one disadvantage that I already pointed out at the very beginning, which is it's early. Yeah, I mean, it was great at the time. I got some really solid data. I could start building my model here on that, right? That was great. But I immediately said, but that data could underestimate the IFR because those people most at risk, which therefore drive the IFR, tend to get exposed to the virus more slowly than the average of the population. And remember, I had some data from California, where the local CDC actually showed that people above 65 had only, I think, 2/3 of the penetration of the average population. So 1/3 less, right? So that's significant, right? And that's exactly what I mean, right? There's this, they will eventually get exposed, but later, right? And so, you know, but I also had reasons to say, but nevertheless, there's also mechanisms that drive the IFR down rather than up, including future variants being more likely to be less harmful than more harmful, as we learned with Omicron was actually the case, right? With Delta, maybe not yet, but with Omicron, that turned out to be the case. So, but conceptually, that was always clear. I always said there can be exceptions, so there is a plausible way it could go, the IFR could go up of the next variant and not down, right? It is possible, right? But it's not very likely. More likely it will go down, right? I always said that, right? So that was one of the mechanisms, right? And then I talked about vaccines early on. I said when the vaccines come, they will drive down the IFR. But when the vaccines actually came, I never really tried to figure out by how much did they drive down the IFR. I just sort of continued trending it down. But I thought there was more weight on the down forces than the up forces. The up force being, for example, elderly being slower to be exposed, right? And therefore the IFR over time possibly going up. as more and more elderly get exposed eventually. Right? So, but the down forces I thought were stronger. So I had an argument why I was trending the IFR gently down from, I think, 0.24, 0.25, where I started in about July 2021. So here the first data here, August, yeah, so, that period. So when I started the model, I think the previous slide is maybe, never mind, it starts in June already or so. But, so around that time, I started having some IFR figures that I could work with, right? But I always knew, okay, this IFR is still iffy. There's an uptrend because of that aging phenomenon that I just talked about, but there's also down forces. And on the whole, I assumed it would gently trend down. Right? And that's why I, by 1st of March this year, I had come down to 0.19. Yeah. Remember, there's a sort of a ditch here in the middle of the graphic in about June last year, because I had already trended down the IFR to 0.19, and then I got fresh data from India and some other locations, and they were significant and they were higher, and I had to bump it back up. Remember? So yeah. So I've been pushing it down, but when there's a resistance, then I give, right? So you can think of this study that I just found as one of those resistances, right? It's a piece of data that tells me, maybe I've gone down too much with my IFR, and I need to back off, right? Bounce back a little bit, but not by too much, right? So that the gap between green and blue is still about 7%. So 71%. The COVID fatalities as of today, here in the green, the 12.84 equals 71% of the total excess mortality. Yeah, so that's a comfortable number, around 70, right? And the IFR is 0.23, that's still comfortable, right? Because it's still slightly below what the study 18 months ago showed, right? So there's been a slight trending down, but it's been just not as strong as maybe I would have thought. But I can accept that, right? I can say, yeah. And because I do believe in their mortality figures, and I don't believe that the bigger part of those mortalities are other, I do believe that 70% or so must be really COVID, right? Because I've never been able to find enough suicides and other, people inadvertently killed because of, lack of medical treatment. They all exist, but to find a number that is really robust and then show that it's really a large number, I've never been able to do that, right? And so I don't feel like going too far in terms of saying, oh yeah, lots of people here died of other causes. So that's why I think the 70%, whether they're correct, I don't know, but they've been with me for a long time and I feel comfortable with it. So that gets me to COVID fatalities of 12.84. And of course, I also had to recalculate based on the new IFR, I had to recalculate the estimated sort of the peak fatality. There's no peak fatality. Fatality will continue rising, but where it sort of levels off and then goes very slow. And that number is 14.9 million. So just about 15 million. Curiously, my very first figure in March 2 years ago, when I first had an initial calculation, I said, oh, it looks like maybe 15 million COVID fatalities. So coincidentally, I'm back to exactly that 15 million now. So that's sort of the 15 million roughly is the expected number of COVID fatalities when the dust settles. And the dust settles when it's gone underneath the radar screen and it's just become like normal pneumonia, and people no longer distinguish it from other pneumonias. Then we are, that doesn't mean the fatalities are zero, but they are so low that they're under the radar screen. And that for me then is, then I stop modeling. Right. So I'm anticipating that will happen when we hit about 15 million. Yeah. We are not that far away from that, but yeah, we'll see. Okay. Long story, but yeah, quickly, country level mapping progressions. Yeah, Sweden is the prototype, right? And I target because except for the winter last year when they did pull out the hammer and had some measures, they have largely allowed the virus to flow naturally. Now the Swedes are careful people. the population density is not so high outside the big cities anyways. And so for a variety of reasons, penetration in Sweden has been relatively slow, and people have probably just behaved very responsibly and so on. But it's become my prototype. And so the green curve is simply a hand-drawn curve on the basis of the Swedish data. And by and large, you can see the Swedish data conforms with the hand-drawn curve, right? And they're always a couple of weeks behind this reporting. So the figures right now, they look very low, but they will backfill them the next week or two. So, but that's always the case, right? So this is ongoing, it doesn't matter. But you can see that's initially a very high wave, but because the virus really got to Europe only in March, so almost at the end of the cold season, we didn't get that full wave, thankfully, in the first year, right? We got only the tail end of that wave. It was bad enough, right? And then the second wave, the second year, the winter wave is already a bit lower. And it was distorted by the Swedish interventions, but you can roughly figure how it would have been. And then now we're in the third year, and you can see we are somewhat below what my curve suggests, but the curve is anyways just a hypothetical curve. I mean, we are just seeing the joint effect of relatively high penetration, although in Sweden it's still less than 50%, and high vaccination, and Omicron being anyways not replicating in the lung very, very quickly, right? If it gets into the lung. So all of those factors together make us being somewhat below the curve, which, yeah, you would expect. Germany, interesting now, Germany has now overtaken Sweden in terms of fatalities per 1 million people. So for all their hammering that they did early on and all their interventions, it hasn't, compared to Sweden, it hasn't helped, which is what I would have expected, right? So yeah, but I'm glad to report it's coming about now. Until last month, Germany's figure was a bit lower, but I think this may also be because there's a slight excess mortality in Germany that in the model that I'm now in the study that I'm now using, whereas for Sweden there is not, so it may also be just that. But yeah, so you might just say Germany and Sweden have a very similar fatality rate, and they also have similar demographics, so that, so basically that's what you would have expected. Germany may be the demographics slightly worse, to be fair, but on the whole, we'll get to the point, and I said that many months ago, where you will see that all these measures that Germany imposed on their people, and still imposing today, did not actually really have an effect, net, compared to a country that has a similar demographics and a similar IFR, that didn't impose all these things, like Sweden. When the dust settles, you will not see a big difference, which is just to the point. So we are starting to see empirical evidence of what I said all along, which is these measures are not productive. Apart from being illegal and criminal, they're also not productive, right? And can even be counterproductive potentially in the longer run. But that would be hard to prove, I think. But when the dust settles, maybe by the end of this year, whenever we stop and we take account of what happened and we take the record, we may find that Germany has exactly the same fatalities per 1 million pop as does Sweden. And Sweden had a much lighter regulatory policy imposition than Germany. So all these impositions, all these lockdowns and all this panic in Germany is like crazy, right? The mask wearing and people spying on each other, all those terrible side effects of these measures, they are all in vain. They don't save any net people. I think that's what we're gonna end up with. Now that's in the comparison with Sweden, right? Okay, it's only one comparison. You might say that's accidental. That doesn't prove anything. That's true. I don't think it's a proof. It's an indication. but I'm doing my best, right? I can't do magic. I can't create, empirical data where there is none, right? So I can only use what's there, and even what's there, you cannot expect me, as I said many times, you cannot expect me to work 24/7, gathering all the data in the world that's out there, because I do have some other things to do in my life, right? So I'm doing what I can. US, yeah, always been above the line. For a variety of reasons. I talked about it. Per 1 million pop, fatalities are significantly higher than in Germany or Sweden, but it just basically also just means they are further down the road, right? They're at 70% penetration, 70% penetration, and Sweden is less than 50, and Germany is less than 40. Right? So they are largely through. Yeah. Whereas in Sweden and in Germany, you will still get a lot of fatalities, maybe even next winter, right? Because now the winter season is coming to an end, and summer it will be low, but then next winter will come, right? Not that the US will not have fatalities again, but if almost everybody has been exposed at least once, and the US is getting there, then they will not have that many fatalities next year. Boom, they are done, right? So yeah, they have had more fatalities up to now, but they will have fewer fatalities per capita in the future. So they are just done more quickly than either Sweden or Germany. So yeah, nothing too surprising here. I mean, except really in the last 2 weeks, the fatality numbers in the US have really dropped very steeply. And there's no measures, right? A year ago, in March last year, the reason it dropped off very quickly was primarily because of vaccines, right, that really kicked in and really had an effect in the short term. Right? But this time it's just dropping off just because many people are now immunized, either naturally or through vaccines or both. Omicron is more harmless, even more harmless than the other varieties. Winter is coming to an end, and people are just having a normal life, and the fatalities are low. So that's very good. So by the looks of it, the US is basically done. Of course, if now a new variant appears that somehow is very different, and that may well happen, fatalities will go up again, right? Everywhere, including in the US. So when I say a country is done, this virus is here to stay, and there will always be some fatalities. There will always be some new variants, just like this influenza, where occasionally you can have a new strain that is so different that you get a few million fatalities. That can happen, yes. But as a base load, normal average year, the US will no longer have to worry about this virus. Yeah, when this winter is complete, then they are there. And we are getting there, right? We are now at the tail end of this winter. They are largely done. Right? Similar, by the way, for the UK. Yeah. And the UK actually said to last September, that was, I said before, that was really commendable, right? That Prime Minister said, okay, Freedom Day, July, yeah. And the summer is a good time to do it because numbers are naturally very low, right? So people will accept it, right? And even the worrying crowd will accept it, right? And you can see it's worked very well for the UK. I mean, yes, they have fatalities, but they are no longer disturbed by them, right? Whereas in the previous cycles, because of their hammer and then the yo-yo effect, they had like terrible experience. So they overreacted, but then they learned. Right? The UK is one of the countries that actually learned something. And I think they are similar to the US in terms of penetration, near 70% or so, and largely done. Yeah. Whereas Sweden and Germany still have some way to go. And this chart, of course, which I've updated again, kind of shows that, right? You have Sweden and Germany, both are about 9 months away from 90% herd immunity as a combination of first-time infections plus overlaid on that vaccinations for those who actually are at risk. Remember, I have a mechanism behind this, an algorithm that calculates that. So I'm not just stacking up, natural immunizations and on top of that, the vaccinations. First of all, they overlap, big deal. And secondly, I really try to divvy out those that are wasted, all those the majority of vaccinations don't count because they're given to people who don't need them, right? So I've taken that into account. Right? So Sweden with less than 50% infection ratio and 75% vaccination ratio, even that taken together is still 9 months away at current run rates from having 90%, because that 90% relates to those people who really matter. Yeah, Germany is similar. You can see most of the back to normal countries are done. Most of the muddled through countries are not done, but they are not so far away from being done. And the new normal countries are far away from being done. Yeah. Last time you saw Japan and Korea, I think especially Korea, the number of months being quite small, but that was just because they were in the middle of ramping up a very steep vaccination program, but they're now leveling off with the vaccination program, and that's why the number is bigger again this month. It's because they're, even though they now have a lot of fatalities and therefore a lot of cases, they're still, oh, sorry, I didn't update the numbers correctly. This is not correct, I'm sorry. They're still low in the infection ratio, but these numbers are too low. I think I forgot to update down there. Japan is about 12%, and Korea is near 10%. So sorry, I must have, I just see it now. These are last time's numbers, forgot to update. Both Japan and Korea have significantly higher numbers now. In Japan, it's because the study tells me that there's a significant excess mortality, which, by the way, the Economist has also always said, but the government data published by the Japanese government didn't show that. So that was my dilemma, right? So I was conservative and took the lower number, but now I'm taking the number from the study, or the mix between the study and the Economist, and Japan does have some significant excess mortality. And so that's why Japan, the penetration now is already 12 or 13 or even 14%. So yeah, I'll correct it for next time. And Korea doesn't have a high excess mortality by any of those data sources. So all of them agree on that. But it has recently, in the last months, had very significant increase in fatality. So Korea is now really going a more natural, they've given up on this like zero COVID policy or whatever it's called. And, you know, they allow the virus to circulate. I think that people are starting to want to get back to normal, even in Korea. And so their penetration now is already like 10%. And remember, my penetration calculation is always a bit delayed because I'm using the fatalities, but fatalities always are 2 or 3 weeks behind the actual infection, right? So if my calculation says they are at 10%, then the actual will be at, I don't know, 15% already. Yeah, but that's okay. I mean, that's just, you know, it's just a slight time gap because of my methodology, right? But so South Korea now is having had for 2 years very low infection rates, is now really going up fast. Nevertheless, so the 12 months is correct, even though I forgot to update the number here. In my model, the number is correct. So the 12 months, you know, is correct according to my model. It's just that I didn't type it in properly here. So Korea should be somewhere just below 10%. Okay. Yeah, this data I don't need to talk about. I've just updated it now. Now that I've ramped up my COVID fatality figures, I had to ramp up these numbers here as well. And you know, the total expected now is, as I said, 15 million. So I distributed the 15 million forward. So in 2022, now we will still have, you know, a fairly significant 2 million COVID fatalities. You know, previously I had significantly less than that. So this year is still. And we've seen that this winter has had quite a lot of fatalities, and also the Southern Hemisphere countries, there's still some way to go. So some places, I mean, they're not so populous, but places like Argentina and Chile and Australia, New Zealand, and, you know, South Africa and so on. There's still some fatalities to come, although, you know, South Africa is probably pretty much true. But, you know, so because their winter is now starting, right? So we will get some figures down there. But so we'll see. I mean, this is very tentative data, but you can see how my current thinking is that it takes a few years for COVID to become just another cold virus and, just become another part of a normal annual pneumonia phenomenon. Back to basically the trend line that we were on before COVID hit us, right? So by 2027, or maybe already by 2025, nobody will bother to count, basically, because it's too small to matter. So these things, just updated that. Yeah, here that's an interesting one, right? So with the new mortality, excess mortality figures, and my assumptions about the IFR, the gap between people saved by government policy and people killed by government policy has actually gotten bigger. Now, I would, as I said, I'm a little bit skeptical that those excess mortality figures are maybe a bit at the high end. So I would be a bit cautious here, but on the current evidence, on my current model, 15 times as many man-years were destroyed by government policy, killed, than saved. And that's partially because those killed are often in the prime of their time, right? Some of them are young. Whereas those who die and who are prevented from dying are only prevented from dying by a few years, because their life expectancy is only 4 or 5 years on it. Yeah. So the saving saves just a few man-years, whereas if you destroy a life, depends on what type of life it is, but if it's a young person who commits suicide in connection with COVID, then you've destroyed 50 man-years in one go, right? Yeah. So calculated in man-years, the man-years killed by government exceed the ones saved by government by more than an order of magnitude, based on these current figures. And the vaccination mania, it's abating. I mean, vaccinations have trended down. People are, of course, many people are vaccinated by now. Not everybody wants these boosters, and not all governments force these boosters on you. Governments have started to go to a policy where they say, okay, boosters only for the elderly. So they've finally realized that there's such a thing as a risk group. I don't know why it took 2 years, but yeah, they are starting to, so they are less forceful pushing vaccinations on other people who don't really need them. So yeah, so maybe we won't get to near 100% penetration as I feared, and maybe we won't have near 8 billion humans who have been vaccinated, but we are at 4.2 billion, and that's not including China. So yeah, and that's 3 billion more than would have been required. Yeah. So the vast majority, 3/4 of all people who have been vaccinated didn't need it. And that's even considering that the 1 billion is very generous. My definition of who is at risk is quite broad, okay? So I've already taken that into account, but we cannot know for sure, right? So really those 3 billion, 3.2 billion people here who were vaccinated who really weren't at risk, they really weren't at risk. They really didn't need it. And as I said before, it may be a negative for some people in that if it keeps the virus off you, and you're not fully exposed to this variant, and maybe not the next variant, it really reduces your immune system's ability to adapt to this new virus. It really slows it down. Yeah. So it can, for those 3 billion who didn't need it, this can be a negative. This is not just a waste. It is potentially counterproductive. Yeah. Here we are in our long-term scenarios. Yeah. So at the moment, we are still primarily going Walking Dead. I haven't changed that yet. I don't see anything really changing yet. I am not so in tune with young people. I've always said maybe the young people are the ones who go northeast, they go into the metaverse, right? I remember I have these, I've added one, there may be a split, and I'm not yet saying that I see it, but it's just an idea. that the young ones go northeast and the old folks go southwest. And I've added one, which is Putin lands. So to go to war for some nationalistic reason is sort of some kind of a romanticism, right? A new romanticism. So if Putin signaled that there is a movement back to, you know, a romantic past of nationalistic symbolism, values, then maybe there is a third arrow here, or possibility. Right? So that was for me a little bit of a new pointer, new data point. Yeah. As I said, I didn't really expect Putin to do that. I didn't really expect that this kind of an invasion would happen in the 21st century, at least not in Europe. I was proven wrong. And now the question is that a one-off or is it a trend? Right? I mean, you could imagine China invading Taiwan, similar, right? Also this kind of, oh, we really own it and it's really cultural, we're really brothers, but they have no right to do it their way, you know, and we will impose our, you know, our national mechanisms onto them. I mean, you know, so China invading Taiwan is not so different from, I mean, in terms of the rationale, from Russia invading Ukraine. Yeah? It's a nationalistic imposition. Right? It's a Woodrow Wilson-esque argument. And Hong Kong, they de facto already invaded, right? So without using troops so much. So yeah, in Macau, anyways, Macau has immediately surrendered. Right? Rape me. Okay, we rape you. Taiwan will not so easily surrender. So you know, possibility we have another one of these invasions in Taiwan at some point, right? And there are other scenarios, right? Other possibilities. So, you know, so is there, you know, is there a kind of a new romanticism where people go back to, we are embodied, like soldiers, you know, and we have an ethnicity and we are a nation and we speak a language. And we want to self-realize by bringing all of us into the same, under the same roof. I mean, I'm not sure this is going to happen because this looks rather old-fashioned, but Putin has just done it, right? Yeah, and so it could happen again, right? So let's see. Yeah. That brings me to the end. I'm still standing on my head, and I will be standing on my head until I have my freedoms back completely. And where I'm sitting right now, that will take a long time. So with that, I wish you all the best and see you in a month's time. Take care. Bye.